Hey there, tonight we're exploring the heart of a 17th century German village at Christmas, where the air is thick with the scent of spices, and the truth is, the magic of the season hides under a layer of soot and stories that would make even the brothers grim pause. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. The crisp winter air in a 17th century German village was less a gentle breeze and more a bracing slap to the face. But hey, who doesn't love a good wake-up call, right? Nestled between dark, creaky woods and fields that seemed perpetually frozen, these villages were like tiny islands in a sea of snow and history. As the year wound down, the excitement of Christmas was as palpable as the cold, though not quite as universally joyful as our modern postcards might suggest. Let's set the scene. It's the year 1650, and you're in a German village, which, statistically speaking, could mean anything from a hamlet of 20 souls to a sprawling metropolis of 200. Cities weren't exactly bursting at the seams back then. The village might have been home to a few hundred people, all of whom knew each other's business better than a modern algorithm knows your shopping habits. And oh, the smells. Forget the romantic aroma of gingerbread wafting through the air. It was more like a pungent blend of livestock, smoke, and the occasional whiff of homemade sausages. If you were lucky, that is. Now, about that Christmas cheer. While today's festivities often focus on gift-giving and overindulgence, back then, survival was higher on the priority list. The winter months were a time of scarcity, not excess. Food stores were rationed carefully, because no one wanted to be the village that ran out of bread in January. The typical diet was heavy on grains and light on anything that wasn't well heavy. Meat was a luxury, not a staple. A pig slaughtered in November had to last months, and nothing went to waste, not even the parts modern folks might rather not discuss over dinner. And the drink of choice, mulled wine, or glühwein, if you want to impress the locals. It was socially acceptable to be slightly tipsy during the holiday season, and for good reason. The wine, spiced with whatever was on hand, cinnamon, cloves, maybe even some pepper, warmed frozen fingers and toes, and made the long, dark nights a little more bearable. Plus, it helped distract from the fact that the nearest bath was a distant memory. Hygiene wasn't high on the priority list. The cold had a way of making water less inviting. Economically, life in a 17th century village was a constant balancing act. Most villagers were subsistence farmers, meaning they grew just enough to feed themselves, and maybe had a little left over to trade. Money was scarce, and barter was king. A chicken might get you a few loaves of bread, or perhaps a new pair of woolen socks if you knew the right people. The idea of buying Christmas presents was as foreign as a summer tan in January. Instead, gifts were simple and practical, like a new wooden spoon or a hand-knitted scarf. Not the stuff of viral unboxing videos, but heartfelt and useful. The village itself was a microcosm of early modern society. At the top of the social pyramid was the local lord, who owned the land and, more importantly, controlled the taxes. Picture a medieval landlord with a penchant for collecting a chunk of whatever you managed to produce. Below him were the peasants, the backbone of the community, who worked the land and kept things running. It was a straightforward, if not very equitable system. The church also played a central role in village life, providing not just spiritual guidance, but also a sense of community and a venue for social gatherings. Because even in the 1600, people needed a place to mingle. And let's not forget the weather. Winter in Germany was no joke. The temperature often dipped below freezing, and snow was a constant companion. Homes were small and built to keep out the cold as best they could, with thick walls and tiny windows. The hearth was the heart of the home, literally. It was where meals were cooked, and families gathered to keep warm. Firewood was a precious commodity, and chopping wood was as much a part of daily life as checking your phone is today. So, Christmas celebrations were more about community and less about commercialism. Villagers gathered at the church for services, which offered a rare opportunity for socializing and maybe a break from the daily grind. Singing carols wasn't just for fun. It was a way to bond and lift spirits. The songs themselves were often about hope and endurance, reflecting the realities of life in a world that could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. In short, Christmas in a 17th century German village was a time of modest cheer mixed with practical concerns. It was about finding joy in the small things, a warm drink, a shared meal, a moment of laughter around the fire. It was a celebration not of what you had, but of who you were with, which, come to think of it, might be a lesson worth remembering today. And speaking of modest cheer, let's zoom in on the economic puzzle that was Christmas in a 17th century German village. Picture this. You're a farmer who's just managed to eke out a decent harvest before the snow starts falling like it's got a personal vendetta against your crops. Now, you're facing the festive season, and the question is, how do you celebrate without sending your finances into a death spiral? Spoiler. It's a challenge worthy of a reality TV show. First up, the elusive Christmas feast. A spread fit for a holiday gathering was less about culinary ambition and more about strategic allocation of limited resources. Imagine a potluck where everyone brings whatever they can spare, and you're getting close. Those elaborate feasts you might have read about. They were more myth than reality for the average villager. Sure, the noble families up the road might have tables groaning under the weight of roasted game and exotic fruits, but for a small farmer, that was fantasy territory. The centerpiece of the village Christmas meal was likely to be a modest roast, maybe a goose if you were well off, or on friendly terms with someone who was. Goose, by the way, was like the caviar of poultry back then, and if that failed, perhaps a rabbit or a chicken would do. The real star, though, was often a humble stew, hearty and filling, made from root vegetables and whatever scraps of meat were available. It was all about calories, not cuisine. After all, you couldn't roast a pig every Sunday without risking a revolt from your future self in February. Now, let's talk trimmings. Those cranberries and chestnuts we now associate with festive meals. Forget about it. We're talking basic root vegetables like turnips and cabbages, staples that were more endurance food than holiday treat. And as for dessert, well, if you were lucky, someone might have rustled up a bit of dried fruit, or if the stars aligned, a slice of a spiced bread known as stollen. Think of it as the ancestor of fruitcake, with all the dense, chewy charm you'd expect. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. There was beer. Ah, beer. Because sometimes you need a little liquid encouragement to handle the in-laws or the neighbor who insists on carol singing off-key. Beer was the drink of the people, a fermented friend that was cheaper than wine and more reliable than the village gossip. A decent mug of beer would set you back a fraction of what wine might cost, say a few pfennigs, depending on the generosity of your local brewer and the quality of the last barley harvest. And then there were the gifts, or lack thereof. The modern expectation of Christmas gifts that practically need a moving truck was about as foreign as a smartphone is to a snail. Back then, the idea of gifting was rooted in practicality. If you were really flush, you might give an orange, which was the equivalent of gifting a luxury car today. These little citrus gems were rare, often imported from Spain or Italy, and could cost a small fortune. Think weeks' worth of wages for a single fruit. It's no wonder they were treated like precious jewels. A child receiving an orange might have felt like they'd been handed the moon, ripe and juicy. Other gifts were more utilitarian. A new pair of mittens, perhaps, knitted by a family member who was likely praying you'd stop losing the ones they made last year. Maybe a hand-carved toy, if someone in the village had a knack for whittling and time on their hands. But even these simple gifts required time and resources that were often in short supply. And let's not forget the church. The church played a central role not just in spiritual life, but in the village economy. Tithes were collected, sometimes in the form of produce or livestock, and Christmas was no exception. It was a time to show your devotion both spiritually and materially. The church was also the venue for communal gatherings, where people came together to share what little they had and to find solace in shared songs and stories. In essence, Christmas in a 17th century German village was a masterclass in making do. It was about stretching what you had, in both material and spirit, to cover the distance between hope and necessity. The realities were stark: frostbitten fingers, empty larders, and the ever-present spectre of hunger. But the human spirit, as it turns out, is remarkably resilient. So, while we might look back at these times with a kind of romantic wonder, it's worth remembering that the magic of Christmas was less about what you had and more about who you shared it with. It wasn't about the size of the feast, but the warmth of the company. And that, my friends, might just be the real gift that history has to offer us. Stick around as we continue to unravel the wonders and woes of Christmas past, because there's plenty more to unwrap. Now, let's put on our warmest historical spectacles and dive into the political and social tapestry that made up Christmas in a 17th century German village. It's a place where church bells rang not just for holy days, but as reminders of the social order and a time when village elders were the original influencers, sans Instagram filters. Forget the festive glow of fairy lights. This was a world illuminated by the flickering flames of political maneuvering and social obligations. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the church in the village. The church wasn't just a spiritual sanctuary. It was more like the village Swiss Army knife, serving multiple purposes in one. It was a place of worship, a community center, and a powerful political entity rolled into one. And who was at the helm? The local priest, a figure who wielded more influence than the modern-day mayor. Think of him as the original multitasker, juggling prayers and politics with equal dexterity. During Christmas, the church's role became even more pronounced. It hosted the central event of the season, the Christmas Mass. This was the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster movie premiere, with villagers filling the pews not just out of devotion, but because missing it meant social suicide. It was the place to see and be seen, and trust me, nobody wanted to be the one who missed out on the juicy post-Mass gossip. Speaking of which, let's address the sartorial spectacle that was the Christmas Mass. The village elders, those wise sages of yore, often saw this as an opportunity to dust off their most questionable fashion choices. Picture this, an elder strutting into Mass wearing a tunic that might have been the height of fashion a decade ago, but now resembles something a moth would turn its nose up at. And yet, these outfits were more than mere clothes. They were symbols of status and influence. A threadbare cloak might hint at financial strain, while a new hat could suggest a bumper harvest or a particularly successful trade deal. It's like reading a social media feed where every post is a carefully curated status update. But don't be fooled into thinking it was just the church calling the shots. Local governance played a crucial role in shaping the festivities. The village council, a group of elected or appointed men who managed local affairs, had their fingers in many pies. They were the ones who decided how much of the village's meager resources could be allocated to the Christmas celebrations. Their decisions could make or break the holiday spirit, turning a potential winter wonderland into a fiscal wasteland if they weren't careful. And here's where the plot thickens. Who benefited from these gatherings? On the surface, it might seem like a community affair, but dig a little deeper, and you'll find that the spoils were often unevenly distributed. The local lord, for instance, was like the Grinch who skimmed off the top. His cut came in the form of increased rents or additional tithes, all under the guise of festive generosity. It was a medieval PR stunt worthy of a modern-day spin doctor, with the lord playing benevolent benefactor while quietly lining his pockets with the village hard-earned produce. Meanwhile, the village council members, those crafty custodians of the community purse, often benefited from the goodwill generated by their decisions. A well-planned celebration could cement their popularity, ensuring they'd be re-elected or at least not chased out of town with pitchforks. They had a knack for orchestrating events that appeared generous while strategically ensuring that key allies were rewarded with the best cuts of meat or the choicest mugs of mulled wine. And let's not forget the role of the church in this medieval game of thrones. The priest often acted as a mediator, smoothing over disputes and ensuring the Lord's demands didn't completely bankrupt the villagers. He was the one who urged generosity in tithes and offerings, while also reminding the Lord of his Christian duty to show mercy. It was a delicate dance, with the priest acting as the moral compass, steering the village through the choppy waters of political intrigue and social expectation. Now, you might be wondering about the rest of the villagers, the peasants, the artisans, the backbone of the community. What did they get out of these gatherings? Well, apart from a chance to escape the daily grind and perhaps snag a slice of that elusive Christmas roast, they gained something intangible yet invaluable, a sense of community and shared identity. In a world that could be brutally isolating, these gatherings were a reminder that they were part of something larger than themselves. a patchwork quilt of people bound by shared struggles and occasional triumphs. And so, while the political and social dynamics might seem like a medieval game of chess, with power players maneuvering for advantage, at its heart, Christmas was about community. It was a time when the village came together, not just to celebrate the birth of Christ, but to reaffirm their bonds and renew their commitment to one another. It was a season of giving, not just in material terms, but in spirit, a reminder that even in the harshest of winters, warmth could be found in the hearts of those who gathered together. So, as we peel back the layers of this historical holiday onion, remember that beneath the politics and social maneuvering, there was a genuine desire to connect, to celebrate, and to endure. And that's a sentiment that resonates even today, as we continue to navigate our own complex web of social dynamics and festive traditions. Stick around, because there's plenty more to explore as we continue our journey through the frosty, fascinating world of 17th century Christmases. And speaking of frosty, fascinating worlds, let's unravel the tapestry of traditions that have somehow morphed from gritty reality into the stuff of glossy holiday cards. Were wreaths really hung with care? And did villagers belt out carols with the gusto of a Macy's choir? Let's just say, the truth is more tangled than a box of Christmas lights. First, let's tackle the tale of the wreath. Today, they're practically synonymous with Christmas cheer, but back in our 17th century village, they were less about decking the halls and more about warding off what might lurk in the wintry darkness. You see, the Germans were a superstitious bunch, and wreaths, crafted from evergreen branches, were thought to have protective properties. They hung them not just during Christmas, but throughout the year, serving as a botanical burglar alarm against malevolent spirits. Sure, they looked festive, but their purpose was more about ghost-busting than guest-welcoming. And what about the notion of carolers parading through the village streets, spreading joy and a bit of discomfort to those who prefer silent nights? Well, yes and no. Singing was indeed a cherished part of the festivities, but the tunes were likely less jingle bells and more Lord, have mercy. Villagers sang hymns and religious songs, often in church or around the hearth. The concept of strolling merriment was as foreign as a snowman in July. The closest thing to caroling was the tradition of wassailing, where folks would toast to the health of their orchards and crops. It was a ritual that involved a lot of cider and a bit of singing, but more for appeasing the spirits than entertaining the neighbors. Now, let's stir the pot on the idea of a picture-perfect Christmas dinner. The notion of tables groaning under the weight of sumptuous roasts and decadent desserts. Pure fantasy for most. We've already mentioned the humble nature of these meals, but let's dive deeper. That famous German Stollen, for instance, wasn't exactly the moist, fruit-filled loaf you might find today. Back then, it was more akin to a brick with raisins, dense and built to last, much like the villagers themselves. Sugar and spices were expensive imports, reserved for the wealthy. If you were lucky, your Stollen might have a hint of cinnamon or a dusting of sugar, a rare treat rather than a staple. And speaking of treats, let's not forget the fabled Christmas markets. Today, they're a delightful blend of twinkling lights and artisanal crafts, but in the 1600s, they were more about necessity than nicety. Markets sprung up around Christmas mainly because that's when trade slowed down due to the weather. They were practical venues for buying and selling essential goods, not the festive wonderlands we see now. Imagine a farmer trudging through snow to barter for a set of iron tools while sipping on a steaming mug of glühwein to keep his spirits and extremities warm. It was less about holiday cheer and more about survival shopping with a side of mulled wine. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the lack of one. The Christmas tree. The idea that every German household had a fir tree festooned with baubles and lights. Not so fast. The tradition of the Christmas tree began in Germany, sure, but it didn't take root until the late 18th century. Before that, if you wanted to see a decorated tree, you'd likely have to visit Strasbourg or look at the homes of the nobility, who had the time and resources to indulge in such fanciful displays. For the average villager, a tree indoors was more of a fire hazard than a festive centerpiece. And let's not forget the gift-giving myth. The modern image of children tearing into piles of gifts might evoke warm fuzzies, but it's a far cry from the reality for our 17th century friends. We've touched on this before, but it bears repeating. Gifts were practical, sparse, and often homemade. The idea of wrapping paper and ribbons was as alien as a unicorn in a barnyard. If you got an orange, you were living large. It was more about the thought than the thing itself, a notion that might be a bit unwrapped in today's consumer-driven society. So why, you might wonder, do we hold onto these romanticized images of Christmas past? Well, nostalgia has a way of polishing the past into something shinier than it ever was. Our ancestors' realities were harsh. Long winters, scarce resources, and the constant spectre of uncertainty. Traditions, however modest, offered a sense of continuity and hope. Over time, as societies grew wealthier and more stable, these traditions were embellished, evolving into the more opulent rituals we know today. In short, while our hallmark fantasies are rooted in history, they've been significantly embellished by centuries of storytelling, and let's be honest, a little creative embellishment. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss them entirely. These myths hold a kind of charm and warmth that resonates, even if the reality was far more grounded. The magic of Christmas lies not just in the traditions themselves, but in the way they've been transformed and treasured across generations. So there you have it, a peek behind the tinsel curtain, revealing a Christmas that was as much about making do as it was about merriment. Stay tuned, because there's more to explore as we continue our journey through the frosty, fascinating world of 17th century Christmases. There's still plenty of myth-busting and historical nuggets to uncover before we wrap things up. And so, we've arrived at the slippery intersection where history and holiday custom meet, like a snowplow and a sleigh. As we cozy up to our modern Christmas with its twinkling lights, bearded Santas, and gift-wrapped excess, it's worth pondering how much of our current celebration is rooted in the frosty soil of 17th century German villages. Spoiler alert, it's less about the tinsel and more about the spirit. Let's start with the big one, the almighty Christmas gift. Today, the holiday often feels like a high-stakes exchange of goods, each present a potential minefield of social expectations and credit card debt. In 2022, Americans splurged an average of $886 per person on Christmas gifts, according to the National Retail Federation. Compare that with our humble villagers, for whom a handmade wooden spoon was the height of generosity. They'd likely be baffled by our modern gift-giving frenzy, where the unspoken rule seems to be go big or go home. But peel back the glossy paper, and you'll find a shared core. The desire to show love and appreciation. Whether it's a handcrafted trinket or the latest gadget, both eras understood that gifts, however modest or extravagant, are expressions of care. It's a reminder that the best gifts come from the heart, not the wallet, a sentiment that survived the centuries, even if our shopping habits haven't. Now, let's talk about food. The feasts of today, replete with turkeys, hams, and sides that could feed a small army, owe much to the scarcity-driven creativity of our ancestors. Back then, a Christmas meal was about sustenance, not spectacle. A roast goose was a luxury, a far cry from our ubiquitous holiday turkeys. Yet the essence of gathering around a table, sharing stories and sustenance, remains unchanged. Whether it's a turkey or a turnip stew, the heart of the meal is the company you keep. And what about those Christmas markets? While we now stroll through them sipping overpriced hot cocoa, our 17th century friends saw them as a lifeline, a chance to secure necessities rather than knickknacks. Yet even today, those bustling stalls offer more than just goods. They are places of connection, where community spirit is as thick as the scent of cinnamon in the air. The tradition of markets as communal hubs hasn't waned, it's merely been sprinkled with a bit more glitter. Speaking of glitter, let's not forget the role of religion. The church, once the epicenter of Christmas events, has ceded ground to secular celebrations in many parts of the world. Yet, the spiritual undertones linger. Whether it's midnight mass or a quiet moment of reflection amidst the chaos, there's still a sense of seeking something greater than ourselves during the season. It's a nod to our enduring quest for meaning, even if the way we express it has evolved. Now, let's address the elephant, or rather, the Christmas tree, in the room. Once a rarity, today it's a staple in holiday decor, with an estimated 25 to 30 million real Christmas trees sold in the United States alone each year. What was once a symbol of status and luxury in 17th century noble homes has become a universal emblem of the holiday season. The tree's journey from exclusive to inclusive mirrors our collective desire to bring a bit of nature indoors. to create a shared sense of wonder and warmth. And then there's the music. Modern carols, those earworms that loop endlessly from November to December, owe a debt to the village hymns and warsailing songs of yore. While our ancestors may not have crooned about reindeer or jingling bells, their songs served a similar purpose, to lift spirits, foster camaraderie, and provide a soundtrack to the season. The tunes may have changed, but the melody of joy remains the same. So, what does all this tell us about our present-day festivities? For one, it underscores the timelessness of human connection. Whether it's through gifts, meals, or music, the heart of Christmas has always been about bringing people together. In a world that often feels divided, this season remains a beacon of unity, a time when differences are set aside and common ground is celebrated. It also highlights our penchant for nostalgia. The romanticized version of Christmas we cling to is, in part, a yearning for simpler times, a longing for the perceived warmth and authenticity of the past. Yet, as we've seen, the reality was far from idyllic. It's a reminder that while we may idealize traditions, it's the values behind them that truly matter. The resilience, creativity, and community spirit that characterized those early celebrations are the real gifts our ancestors have passed down. And let's not forget our penchant for grumbling about family gatherings. Whether bemoaning a bickering relative or an overcooked turkey, some things never change. Complaining about holiday mishaps might be as traditional as the festivities themselves. After all, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity for humor and resilience, finding light even in the most challenging of circumstances. As we wrap up our journey through the frosty past and the festive present, one thing is clear. Christmas, in all its forms, is a testament to the enduring human spirit. It's a celebration not just of traditions, but of the connections that bind us across time and geography. So, as you gather with loved ones this holiday season, remember that you're part of a long lineage of revelers, each adding their own chapter to the ever-evolving story of Christmas. In the end, whether you're feasting on a feast fit for a king or simply enjoying a quiet moment by the fire, the true gift of Christmas lies in the shared experience. The laughter, the love, and yes, even the occasional family squabble. Because when all is said and done, it's the people, not the presents, that make the season truly magical. And that, dear listeners, is a tradition worth celebrating. Amid the chaos of Tudor England, little Elizabeth Tudor entered a world where family drama was practically an Olympic sport. Born on September 7, 1533, she was the daughter of Henry Roman VIII and Anne Boleyn, the king's second wife. Now, this wasn't your typical bring-your-kid-to-work situation. Elizabeth's family dynamics could rival any modern reality TV show, complete with severed heads and illegitimacy scandals. If you think your family reunions are awkward, consider this. Elizabeth's early years were a precarious balancing act on the chessboard of power. Her mom, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was just 2.5. Henry Roman VIII, her dad, wasn't exactly known for his commitment to marital bliss, having churned through 6 wives faster than a Tudor banquet. Anne's execution, part of what historians call the Great Matter, was a mix of politics, paranoia, and Henry's insatiable desire for a male heir. The king might have been a visionary in some respects, but patience with his spouses was not one of his virtues. Post-execution, Elizabeth's status took a nosedive. She was declared illegitimate, which, in Tudor terms, was like being unfriended on Facebook by the entire kingdom. Her father's solution was to simply pretend she and her older half-sister Mary were non-entities, at least until it was politically convenient to remember them. Elizabeth, however, was no ordinary child. Despite being shuffled around like a pawn, she had a mind sharper than a Tudor lance. Surviving Elizabeth's childhood was a masterclass in political maneuvering. After Henry Roman VIII death in 1547, the throne was a hot potato passed among her half-brother Edward VI, and later Mary I, affectionately known as Bloody Mary, for her enthusiastic persecution of Protestants. Elizabeth, a Protestant herself, tread carefully during Mary's reign. She spent some quality time in the Tower of London, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly Club Med. Her crime, being the Protestant sister to a Catholic queen, a dangerous pedigree when religious affiliations could send you to the chopping block faster than you could say, Hail Mary. In 1554, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower, accused of conspiring against Mary. Picture it, A 21-year-old woman larked away, shadowed by the spectre of her mother's fate. Talk about a stressful family inheritance. But unlike many who entered the tower, Elizabeth was savvy enough to play the game. She denied any involvement in plots against Mary, famously declaring, "I am innocent to a fault." And whether through her cunning or sheer luck, she emerged from the tower with her head intact. The political landscape was as treacherous as the tower's dungeons. After Mary's death in 1558, Elizabeth became queen, transforming from an overlooked, illegitimate daughter to a monarch who would rule for 44 years. Her rise was nothing short of a strategic masterclass. She learned the art of survival in a court where alliances shifted with the wind and heads rolled with alarming frequency. Elizabeth's early life reads like a primer on how not to grow up. Trauma, political intrigue, and family betrayals were par for the course. Yet these experiences forged her into one of history's most formidable queens. Her reign would be marked by the flourishing of English culture and the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but those are tales for another time. For now, we marvel at how a girl declared illegitimate and imprisoned could rise to such dizzying heights. As they say, the pen is mightier than the sword, but in Elizabeth's case, it was her wits that outshone them all. Elizabeth's rise to power wasn't just a royal upgrade, it was a full-blown Tudor makeover. When she took the throne in 1558, England was economically about as stable as a Jenga tower in a windstorm. The country was hemorrhaging money from costly wars, and the crown was in debt to the tune of about £300,000, a hefty sum that would make any finance minister clutch their pearls. Inflation was running rampant, and the English pound was as devalued as a 90s pop star's comeback tour. So, Elizabeth had her work cut out for her, stepping into this fiscal quagmire like a seasoned CEO ready to restructure a failing company. But Elizabeth wasn't just in it for the economic spreadsheets. Her ascent was a masterstroke of political theatre, and she knew how to work a crowd. She was a PR genius centuries before spin doctors became a thing. Take her coronation, for example. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a spectacle of political branding. Elizabeth paraded through London adorned in regal finery, winning hearts with every wave and smile, turning the streets into a Tudor version of a red carpet event. She had a knack for balancing grandeur with accessibility, making her subjects feel like they were part of something bigger, a savvy move in a world where monarchs were often as approachable as a porcupine in a petting zoo. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the throne room, Elizabeth's gender. In a world where ruling was strictly a man's game, she flipped the script. Elizabeth didn't shy away from her femininity, she weaponized it. She famously declared in 1563, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." It was a bold statement that said, "I'm here, I'm a woman, and I'm calling the shots." She turned her perceived weakness into a strength, and in doing so, she became a prototype for female leadership in a patriarchal society. And then there's the Virgin Queen mythology, which Elizabeth cultivated like a master gardener tending to a prized rose. The image of her as a chaste, devoted monarch was both a political strategy and a practical necessity. Remaining unmarried allowed her to avoid the pitfalls of foreign alliances and domestic power struggles that could arise from choosing a husband. It was a clever move, but let's not romanticize it too much. The reality was that Elizabeth had to constantly fend off suitors and navigate the treacherous waters of international diplomacy without the safety net of a royal consort. Her virginity became not just a personal choice, but a political tool, a symbol of her independence and England's sovereignty. However, ruling as a single woman wasn't all sunshine and propaganda. Elizabeth faced very real challenges in a man's world, where every decision was scrutinized through a lens of gender politics. She was often criticized for not marrying, with advisors constantly reminding her that a woman on the throne was like a ship without a captain. Yet Elizabeth steered her course with the precision of a seasoned sailor, proving that a single woman could rule as effectively, if not more so, than her male counterparts. Elizabeth's reign was a delicate dance of diplomacy and power, a balancing act between the old ways and the new. She embraced the Renaissance spirit, fostering a cultural flowering that would make any art historian swoon. Under her patronage, figures like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe flourished, turning England into a cultural powerhouse. But while the arts thrived, Elizabeth's political landscape was fraught with danger. She had to contend with plots and conspiracies, not least from Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the Catholic poster child for those who saw Elizabeth as a heretical usurper. Economically, Elizabeth's policies were cautious but effective. She reformed the currency and tightened the purse strings, ensuring that England's finances slowly crawled back from the brink. Her reign saw the rise of English trade and exploration, setting the stage for the eventual expansion of the British Empire. Elizabeth's ability to stabilize the economy while navigating the treacherous waters of court politics was nothing short of miraculous. As we delve further into Elizabeth's reign, keep in mind that her story is one of contrasts, a tale of romance and reality, myth and pragmatism. She was both a queen and a woman, a ruler who wielded her femininity like a weapon in a world dominated by men. Her legacy is not just one of power, but of clever adaptation, of turning perceived weaknesses into strengths. Elizabeth was a master strategist, a shrewd politician, and above all, a survivor in a world where survival was never guaranteed. But the story doesn't end here. There's so much more to explore, from her battles with the Spanish Armada to her complex relationships with the men in her life. So, stay tuned as we unravel more of this incredible tapestry that is the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth I. And so, we sail into the stormy seas of Elizabethan foreign policy, a tempest of ambition, blunders, and some of history's most dramatic naval showdowns. If you thought Game of Thrones had its share of intrigue, it's got nothing on the real-life plot twists of Queen Elizabeth I's reign. Now, let's talk about the Spanish Armada, an episode that's been etched in the annals of history as England's David versus Spain's Goliath moment. Spoiler alert, the little guy wins, but not without a fair share of comedic errors and a hefty price tag. Picture this. The year is 1588, and England is facing down the might of Spain, Europe's reigning superpower. The Spanish Armada, a massive fleet of 130 ships, is on its way to invade England. Spain's King Philip Roman II was determined to overthrow Elizabeth and restore Catholicism. But here's where it gets interesting. Elizabeth wasn't going to sit idly by while Philip sent his invincible armada her way. The English fleet, though smaller and less well-equipped, was ready to engage in a naval dance-off of epic proportions. Now, you might assume that the English victory was all thanks to superior strategy and naval prowess. Sure, that played a part, but let's give a nod to the weather, England's most unpredictable ally. The Spanish Armada was battered by storms, which scattered their formation and turned their carefully laid plans into nautical mayhem. Talk about divine intervention, right? The English, led by the likes of Sir Francis Drake, took full advantage of this chaos. Drake, a man whose exploits read like an adventure novel, was not only a cunning sea captain, but also a pirate with a royal seal of approval. His daring raids on Spanish ports had already made him a thorn in Philip's side long before the Armada set sail. Drake and his fellow commanders used nimble, fast ships to outmaneuver the lumbering Spanish galleons. They employed fire ships, essentially floating bombs, to sow confusion among the enemy ranks. The result, a famous victory that sent the remnants of the Spanish fleet limping back home, battered and humiliated. England's triumph over the Armada wasn't just a military win, it was a propaganda coup. Elizabeth played it for all it was worth, giving a rousing speech at Tilbury that cemented her image as the warrior queen. "I have the heart and stomach of a king," she declared, and with that, a legend was born. But let's not get carried away with romantic notions of Elizabeth as a swashbuckling heroine. The reality was messier. The English victory came at a steep financial cost. The crown was effectively broke, having spent a fortune on defense and naval expansion. Elizabeth, ever the frugal ruler, had to balance the books without plunging her subjects into poverty. She was a master of financial alchemy, turning scarcity into stability. Her government was adept at squeezing every last penny out of the treasury, employing a mix of loans, taxes, and the sale of crown lands. Her economic policies were like a tightrope walk, keeping England afloat amidst tempestuous political waters. Elizabeth's financial acumen was key to her success. She understood that an overtaxed populace was a recipe for rebellion. Instead, she encouraged privateering, essentially legal piracy, as a way to boost the economy and fund naval operations. This policy not only filled the coffers, but also kept the Spanish on their toes. It was a win-win, unless you were a Spanish merchant, in which case it was more of a lose-lose. Elizabeth's approach was pragmatic, even if it sometimes skirted the edges of legality. She knew that a country's strength lay in its economic health as much as in its military might. Her relationship with Sir Francis Drake was emblematic of her shrewd political style. Drake was both a hero and a headache, a man whose exploits brought glory and wealth to England, but also tension with Spain. Elizabeth's patronage of Drake was a calculated risk, a way to project power without declaring outright war. It was a delicate balance, maintaining friendly ties with nations like France while antagonizing Spain. Foreign policy under Elizabeth was a game of chess, each move carefully considered to keep England in the game. The Armada's defeat marked a turning point in Elizabeth's reign, but it didn't mean smooth sailing from there on out. England continued to grapple with threats from abroad and dissent at home. Elizabeth's court was a hotbed of intrigue, her advisers constantly jockeying for position. Amidst this, she maintained a firm grip on power, her keen intellect and political instincts guiding her through the labyrinth of Tudor politics. As we navigate the remaining chapters of Elizabeth's reign, remember that her story is not just one of battles and diplomacy. It's a tale of resilience, of a woman who defied the odds in a world stacked against her. The legend of the Virgin Queen endures, but it's the reality of Elizabeth's rule, her strategic brilliance and economic savvy, that truly sets her apart. There's more to uncover in the saga of Elizabeth I, from her domestic policies to her cultural legacy. So, stay with me as we continue to unravel the life and legacy of one of history's most remarkable rulers. And so we find ourselves in the heart of Elizabethan England, where the arts weren't just flourishing, they were throwing a full-blown Renaissance rave. Under Queen Elizabeth I, England didn't just dip its toes into the cultural waters, it cannonballed in, creating ripples that will be felt for centuries. The Queen herself was the ultimate patron of the arts, turning London into a stage where the likes of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson strutted their stuff. Forget your Netflix binges. The Elizabethan theatre was the place to be, offering everything from tragic love stories to slapstick comedy, often within the same breath. Elizabeth's reign saw the birth of the Globe Theatre in 1599, an iconic wooden O that could pack in up to 3,000 rowdy spectators. Tickets were affordable, with the cheapest seats, or rather, standing sparts, costing a mere penny. For context, that was about the price of a loaf of bread or a pint of ale, making theatre as accessible as your local pub. The groundlings, as they were affectionately known, would crowd the pit, eager for their dose of drama, while the wealthier sorts perched in the galleries, trying to avoid the occasional airborne tomato. But let's not romanticize this golden age too much. Behind the majestic facades of Tudor palaces, daily life for the average Elizabethan was more mud and manure than pomp and pageantry. While the court basked in opulence, the streets of London were a symphony of smells, mostly unpleasant, with sanitation about as effective as a waterproof teabag. The city's population exploded from 50,000 at the start of Elizabeth's reign to roughly 200,000 by her death in 1603, leading to overcrowding that turned London into a bustling, if slightly pungent, melting pot of cultures and classes. And then there was the small matter of the bubonic plague making periodic appearances, as if life wasn't challenging enough. The plague swept through London in 1563, claiming about 20,000 lives, nearly a quarter of the city's population. When outbreaks occurred, theatres were closed faster than a dodgy restaurant after a health inspection. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, these hardships, the arts thrived. People craved escape and connection, and the theatre provided both in spades. Now, while the bard and his contemporaries were penning their plays, Elizabeth was busy crafting her own stage persona. The myth of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the divine monarch, was as much a work of fiction as any play performed at the Globe. Elizabeth was adept at curating her image, understanding that in a world dominated by men, perception was often as powerful as reality. Here's the twist. The Gloriana myth was both a mask and a mirror. It presented Elizabeth as an almost ethereal figure, untouched by mortal concerns. Yet it also reflected the very real political acumen of a woman who had to navigate a landscape filled with pitfalls. Her portraits showed her as an ageless beauty, with flawless skin and a regal demeanor. Never mind that, in reality, she was battling the effects of smallpox scars and the ravages of time. Elizabeth understood the power of image long before Instagram filters made it easy. But let's not get carried away with the fairy tale. Elizabeth's court was a hotbed of intrigue, where alliances shifted with the seasons, and loyalty was as stable as a Jenga tower. Her advisors, such as the astute Lord Burghley and the ambitious Robert Dudley, were constantly jockeying for influence. It was a game of political chess, and Elizabeth was the grandmaster, always 2 moves ahead, even if it meant sacrificing a pawn or 2 along the way. Economically, England under Elizabeth was like a tightrope walker, balancing precariously between prosperity and poverty. The Queen's policies encouraged trade and exploration, with figures like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake pushing the boundaries of the known world. These ventures didn't just satisfy a thirst for adventure. They filled the royal coffers with the spoils of new trade routes and exotic goods. But here's the kicker. Elizabeth's England was a land of stark contrast. While the elite donned sumptuous silks and feasted on lavish banquets, the average Tudor subject was lucky to afford a woolen cloak and a diet that was heavy on bread and porridge. Social mobility was about as likely as finding a unicorn in your backyard. The gap between the haves and the have-nots was as wide as the River Thames, and yet within this disparity, a uniquely English identity was taking root. The cultural renaissance of Elizabethan England was more than just Shakespearean soliloquies and intricate court masks. It was the dawn of a national consciousness, a sense of pride that transcended class and creed. Elizabeth's reign was a time of transformation, where the seeds of empire were sown amidst the mud and mire of everyday life. Her legacy was one of paradoxes, a queen who was both a myth and a reality, a monarch who wielded her femininity like a sword in a world that expected her to wield a scepter. As we continue to explore the life and legacy of Elizabeth I, remember that history is rarely black and white. It's a tapestry of shades and shadows, where the lines between legend and truth blur like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Elizabeth's story is far from over, and the next chapters will delve deeper into the challenges she faced and the impact she left on the world stage. So stay tuned, because the tale of the Virgin Queen is a saga as rich and complex as any play penned by the bard himself, filled with intrigue, ambition, and the indomitable spirit of a woman who dared to defy the odds. As Elizabeth I's reign drew to a close, the winter of her life was marked by a chill that wasn't just from the English weather. The Virgin Queen was facing her final act, and the curtain was about to fall on one of the most illustrious reigns in English history. But unlike the tidy conclusions of a Shakespearean play, her ending was fraught with the complexities and contradictions that had defined her life. By the late 1590, Elizabeth was no longer the vibrant monarch who had once dazzled her court with wit and charm. Time, that relentless thief, had taken its toll. The Queen was in her 60s, a ripe old age back then, considering the average life expectancy was a mere 40 years. Yet, despite the aches and the weariness, she remained a formidable presence, a monarch whose mere gaze could still command a room. The political landscape had shifted too. The loyal advisers who had been the architects of Elizabeth's success, like Lord Burghley and Sir Francis Walsingham, had either died or retired. Their replacements lacked the same gravitas, and Elizabeth found herself increasingly isolated, her once keen political instincts dulled by age and the weight of decades spent in power. Her court, once a vibrant hive of activity, became something of a ghost town, populated by younger courtiers with little memory of the Queen's early triumphs. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, England was a nation on the brink of change. Elizabeth's reign had seen the seeds of the British Empire sown, with explorers like Raleigh and Drake setting the stage for England's global ambitions. The economy, although still precarious, had stabilized under her pragmatic policies. Yet there was an undercurrent of unrest, a sense that the old ways were no longer enough to sustain a rapidly evolving society. The cracks were showing, and Elizabeth, ever the realist, knew it. Her legacy, however, was already being written. Elizabeth had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of European politics, maintaining a delicate balance between the Catholic powers of Spain and France. Her defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was not just a military victory. It was a defining moment that cemented England's naval supremacy and Elizabeth's place in history as a warrior queen. But like any good story, the reality was more nuanced. The victory owed as much to luck and weather as it did to strategy, and the financial strain left England's coffers emptier than a Tudor tavern after last call. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, her much-touted virginity, was both a personal choice and a political masterstroke. By remaining single, she avoided the pitfalls of foreign entanglements and domestic power struggles. Yet, the mythology of the Virgin Queen was as much a construct as any of the plays performed in the Globe Theatre. It was a narrative that Elizabeth carefully curated, understanding the power of image long before modern politicians mastered the art of spin. Her femininity, often seen as a weakness, became her armor, a way to navigate a male-dominated world with grace and authority. As for how she was perceived, Elizabeth was both revered and reviled. Her people admired her resilience and saw her as a symbol of national pride, especially in the wake of the Armada. Yet, her later years were marked by discontent, with critics lamenting her reluctance to name an heir and the economic hardships that lingered like a bad hangover. The Essex Rebellion of 1601, led by the wayward and ambitious Robert de Veru, was a stark reminder that not everyone was content with Elizabeth's rule. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, but it exposed the vulnerabilities of a queen who had once seemed invincible. Elizabeth's death in 1603 marked the end of an era, but the beginning of a legacy that would endure far beyond her lifetime. She had reigned for 44 years, and her passing was met with a national outpouring of grief. Her successor, James VI of Scotland, would inherit a kingdom that was both strengthened and strained by Elizabeth's policies. The union of the crowns under James laid the foundation for the future United Kingdom, a testament to Elizabeth's political foresight and the enduring impact of her reign. In reflecting on Elizabeth's legacy, it's important to separate the woman from the myth. She was a ruler who defied the odds, a queen who turned her perceived weaknesses into strengths. Her reign was a time of cultural renaissance, economic challenges, and political intrigue. She was a master of adaptation, a strategist who understood the art of survival in a world that was often hostile to women in power. Yet, for all her achievements, Elizabeth was not without flaws. Her reluctance to embrace change, her sometimes ruthless approach to dissent, and her failure to address the growing economic divide were all part of the complex tapestry of her reign. She was a ruler who inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure, a woman who wielded her femininity like a weapon in a man's world. Today, the fascination with Elizabeth endures, a testament to her enduring appeal as one of history's most enigmatic figures. She remains a symbol of strength and resilience, a reminder that leadership is as much about perception as it is about power. In the end, Elizabeth was a queen who understood the value of myth-making, crafting a legacy that continues to captivate and inspire. Her life was a story of contrasts, a blend of romance and reality, and a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems. So, as we close the book on Elizabeth's reign, let's raise a glass to the Virgin Queen, a woman who dared to defy expectations and left an indelible mark on the world. Cheers, Your Majesty. You've earned it. In the Grand Theatre of ancient China, the emperor was the star of the show, decked out in yellow robes that screamed, "Look at me, I'm literally the sun." You see, yellow wasn't just a color, it was a statement, a declaration of divine favor. It signaled that the emperor was the living embodiment of the mandate of heaven, a celestial thumbs-up that said, "Yes, this guy's in charge, and you better believe it." This wasn't just a fleeting trend. It was a cornerstone of authority that reigned supreme from the early Zhou dynasty around 1046 BC, all the way through to the end of the Qing dynasty in 1912 AD. That's a solid 3,000 years of yellow being more than just a fashion choice. Now, the mandate of heaven wasn't some vague philosophical waffle. It was a political masterstroke. It was like an ancient version of having a blue checkmark on Twitter, but with the stakes being the empire itself. It was the ultimate form of legitimacy, and losing it could mean losing your head. Get this, if floods, famines, or rebellions struck, folks would start whispering about the emperor losing his divine favor. In a world where natural disasters were a very real-time commentary on leadership, the mandate was a double-edged sword. But the emperor wasn't just sitting around, basking in his own glory. He was surrounded by a court, an entourage of elite bureaucrats and advisors who were the gatekeepers to power. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill entourage. Think more along the lines of political heavyweights who had to pass the rigorous imperial examinations. These exams were no joke. They were intellectual marathons, testing knowledge of Confucian classics, poetry, and even calligraphy. Only the brightest minds made the cut, ensuring that the emperor had a brainy crew to keep the empire ticking along like a well-oiled machine. Despite the grandeur, being an emperor wasn't all sipping tea and admiring the view from the Forbidden City. The reality was more Game of Thrones than fairy tale. The emperor had to be the ultimate multitasker, juggling affairs of state, military campaigns, and the constant threat of being ousted by an ambitious relative or a rebellious general. Power was intoxicating, sure, but it came with a side of paranoia. Take the Yongle Emperor, for example, who reigned from 1402 to 1424 AD. He was so obsessed with securing his rule that he moved the capital to Beijing and constructed the iconic Forbidden City, a sprawling complex with over 9,000 rooms. Talk about an extreme home makeover. And speaking of power, let's debunk the myth of the emperor's all-seeing eye. While it's tempting to think of emperors as omnipotent figures with a finger on the pulse of every corner of their realm, the reality was far less glamorous. Communication over vast distances relied on a network of couriers, with messages taking days, if not weeks, to reach their destination. Information was as slow as a snail on a leisurely stroll, meaning that the emperor's grasp on his empire was more tenuous than you'd expect. It wasn't quite as effortless as an Instagram influencer controlling their narrative with a few taps on their smartphone. The imperial court was a hotbed of intrigue and politics, where alliances were as fragile as a porcelain teacup. The emperors had to navigate a complex web of relationships, balancing the interests of powerful families and factions. The emperor's word was law, but that didn't mean everyone was happy about it. There were always whispers in the corridors, plots brewing under the surface, and more than one emperor met a sticky end thanks to courtly machinations. Remember Emperor Jiajing of the Ming dynasty, who was nearly assassinated by his concubines in 1542. Turns out, the harem wasn't just a place of leisure, it was a political minefield. In the end, the emperor was both the sun and the shadow, the ultimate authority and the eternal target. He was the OG influencer, wielding power that was as precarious as it was profound. And while the myths paint him as an all-seeing, all-knowing ruler, the truth was a tapestry of human ambition, divine rights, and the ever-present threat of downfall. As the top tier of ancient China's social hierarchy, the emperor and his court were a testament to the complex dance of power, legitimacy, and survival that defined one of history's most enduring civilizations. While the emperor was busy juggling power like a circus performer with too many flaming torches, let's shift our gaze to the real intellectual heavyweights of ancient China, the scholars and officials. These were the folks who truly put the bureau in bureaucracy. Picture this: a system that was about as easy to navigate as a hedge maze, designed by someone with a penchant for trickery. At the heart of it all was the imperial examination, a grueling test that made today's standardized exams look like a leisurely Sunday crossword. First, let's give a nod to Confucius, the mastermind behind this whole intellectual endeavor. If there's anyone who deserves to be crowned the original life coach, it's Confucius. Born in 551 BC, his teachings became the ideological backbone of the examination system, and by extension, the entire bureaucratic apparatus. His philosophy was like the Swiss Army knife of ancient China, good for everything from governance to personal conduct. Confucius preached values like filial piety, loyalty, and the importance of education. In a way, he was part philosopher, part motivational speaker, part agony ant for a civilization in need of some serious guidance. Fast forward to the Tang dynasty, around 605 AD, when the imperial examinations really took off. These exams were the ultimate gatekeepers to power and prestige, open to any male with the intellect and tenacity to pass. However, let's not kid ourselves. Social mobility was like trying to climb a greased pole. Sure, in theory, a poor kid from a remote village could become a top official, but in practice, most candidates came from the gentry class. They had the resources to prepare, whether that meant hiring tutors or just having enough leisure time to study instead of working the fields. The exams were as comprehensive as they were intense. Imagine sitting down for a 3-day marathon of mental endurance, where you had to regurgitate Confucian classics, compose poetry, and demonstrate your calligraphy skills. It's no wonder that candidates often emerged from the examination halls looking like they just survived a natural disaster. Success rates were abysmally low. Less than 10% of candidates passed the first level, and only the creme de la creme made it to the top. It was the academic version of a reality TV show, with all the drama and none of the commercial breaks. But what did passing these exams actually get you? Well, besides a lifetime of bragging rights, it earned you a spot in the imperial bureaucracy, a career path as stable as it was prestigious. Scholars who passed the exams became officials, wielding power in provincial governments or even stepping into the halls of the emperor's court. They were the ultimate multitaskers, administrators, judges, tax collectors, and sometimes even military strategists. Think of them as the Swiss Army knives of governance, minus the corkscrew. Yet, for all their brain power, scholars and officials had to be masters of the art of survival. The imperial court was a political minefield, and one wrong step could see you demoted, exiled, or worse. Intellectual gymnastics were a must, and a bit of strategic bootlicking didn't hurt either. Navigating court politics was like playing a never-ending game of chess, and the stakes were often as high as your neck in the guillotine. Take the case of Han Yu, a celebrated scholar of the Tang dynasty who found himself banished to the far reaches of the empire for criticizing the emperor's religious policies. His sharp tongue and sharper pen didn't win him any favors in the political arena. And yet, despite the cutthroat nature of court life, the role of scholars and officials was vital in keeping the empire running smoothly. They were the cogs in the grand machine, ensuring that the emperor's decrees reached every corner of the vast empire. They were responsible for everything from maintaining irrigation systems to collecting taxes and maintaining order in the provinces. In short, they were the unsung heroes, or perhaps anti-heroes, of ancient China's socio-political landscape. In the end, scholars and officials were as much a product of Confucian ideals as they were of political necessity. They were a testament to the power of education and the pursuit of knowledge, even if that pursuit often led them into the murky waters of political intrigue. As we delve further into the labyrinth of ancient China's social hierarchy, remember this. While the emperor was the sun, these scholars were the constellations, guiding the empire through the night with their wisdom, wit, and a fair bit of cunning. While the scholars were crafting elegant verses and navigating the treacherous waters of court politics, let's descend from the ivory towers and take a stroll through the muddy fields where the real work of the empire got done. Meet the peasants and farmers, the unsung heroes of ancient China. These folks were the backbone of society, the ones whose calloused hands and sweat-stained brows ensured that the empire didn't starve. Forget the romantic image of bucolic serenity. This was less Zen garden and more survival boot camp. It's easy to picture a pastoral paradise, a scene straight out of a Chinese landscape painting, with wise old farmers tending to their rice paddies under the tranquil gaze of distant mountains. But let's get real. Life for these farmers was about as idyllic as being stuck in traffic during a monsoon. For starters, farming was a full-contact sport, and not in the gentle yoga retreat sense. We're talking back-breaking labor that started before dawn and ended long after the sun dipped below the horizon. These farmers were up against the elements, armed with little more than rudimentary tools that had all the comfort of medieval torture devices. Take the plough, for instance. In the Han Dynasty, around 206 BC to 220 AD, the iron plough was a revolutionary innovation, yet it was still a beast to handle. Imagine wrestling with a metal contraption that weighed as much as a linebacker, and you get the idea. Sure, it was better than tilling the earth with your bare hands, but only just. And let's not forget the sickle, which had a penchant for doubling as a finger slicer if you weren't careful. Talk about occupational hazards. Then there was the small matter of taxes. When the emperor wanted his cut, he wasn't interested in excuses about floods or failed crops. Taxation was relentless, and it wasn't just about handing over a percentage of your harvest. Sometimes it meant coughing up labor or goods, and often both. The average farmer might have seen up to half of his produce claimed by the state, local lords, or corrupt officials with sticky fingers. It was like living in a permanent episode of Survivor, where the prize was simply making it to next year without starving. Despite the grind, these farmers were the empire's lifeline. Rice, wheat, millet, you name it, they grew it. The bounty of their fields fed the emperor, his court, and the entire bureaucratic machine. While scholars were busy penning poetry about the virtues of hard work, peasants were living it. Ironically, the very Confucian ideals that praised the nobility of labor did little to ease their burdens. The Romanticism was just that, a distant fantasy that bore little resemblance to the daily toil. Now, you might wonder what kept these farmers going. Was it a sense of duty to the empire? Perhaps, but more likely it was the simple need to survive. There were no safety nets, no government bailouts, just the hard reality that if you didn't work, you didn't eat. Period. It was a life as precarious as balancing on a bamboo tightrope, with the abyss of starvation always a misstep away. Even the idea of community, while comforting, was a double-edged sword. Sure, villages were tight-knit, and neighbors often lent a hand during harvest or planting seasons. But they were also insular, and stepping out of line or failing to contribute could lead to social ostracism faster than you could say Confucian harmony. Social cohesion was essential, but came with the price of conformity. And let's not sugarcoat the gender dynamics here. Women in peasant families worked alongside men in the fields, but they also bore the brunt of domestic duties. If you think modern multitasking is tough, try managing a household, raising children, and contributing to the family's farming efforts, all without the aid of modern conveniences. Women were the unsung engineers of their households, making sure everything ran smoothly, while often receiving little credit for their Herculean efforts. But let's not paint an entirely bleak picture. There was room for the occasional celebration. Festivals like the Lunar New Year or the Mid-Autumn Festival offered rare moments of respite and joy. These gatherings were a chance to revel in music, dance, and food, a brief escape from the grind, and a reminder of the shared humanity that connected them all. They were the ancient world's answer to a much-needed long weekend. In the end, the story of the peasant farmer is one of endurance and quiet heroism. While emperors and scholars penned the pages of history, it was the farmers who provided the ink. Their lives were a testament to human resilience, a reminder that the grand narratives of history rest on the shoulders of those who work in the shadows. And as the empire expanded and thrived, it did so on the backs of these unsung heroes. Stories are etched not in stone, but in the furrows of the fields they tended. So next time you think of ancient China, spare a thought for the farmers who plowed, sowed, and reaped so that an entire civilization could flourish. And remember, as we continue to explore this fascinating tapestry of history, there's more to uncover in the layers of this intricate social hierarchy. Stay tuned, because we've only just begun to peel back the centuries. While the farmers toiled away, ensuring the empire's rice bowls didn't run dry, let's pivot to the merchants and artisans, the unsung middlemen who turned trade into an art form and art into trade. Picture these folks as the ancient hustlers of commerce, trapped in a paradox where their skills were as valued as they were vilified. Despite the fact that they kept the wheels of the economy greased, merchants were often viewed with more suspicion than a cat burglar at a jewelry store. Now, here's the kicker. In a Confucian society that prized agriculture and scholarly pursuits, merchants were considered the lowest rung on the social ladder. Yet, the very folks who brought luxury goods like silk, tea, and porcelain to the farthest reaches of the known world were seen as little more than necessary evils. It was as if being good at business was akin to having a moral failing. Why, you ask? Because profit was a dirty word, my friends. Take silk, for instance. This wasn't mere fabric. It was the ancient equivalent of Bitcoin, volatile, valuable, and shrouded in mystery. The production of silk, starting around the 27th century BC, was a state secret so closely guarded that smuggling silkworms could earn you a one-way ticket to the afterlife. Yet, despite the cloak and dagger nature of its trade, silk was a gold mine. Merchants who dealt in silk could amass fortunes that rivaled those of the nobles. The irony. While the nobles flaunted their silk robes, the merchants who sold them these luxurious threads were often seen as pariahs. But let's not shed too many tears for these savvy entrepreneurs just yet. Despite their low social status, some merchants lived like kings. Take the case of the Shanxi merchants during the Ming and Qing dynasties. These guys were like the Wall Street tycoons of their time, controlling vast networks that spanned from the opulent markets of Beijing to the bustling ports of Southeast Asia. Their secret, diversification. They traded in everything from salt to silver, and their wealth allowed them to wield influence that no mere peasant or even minor official could hope to match. And speaking of influence, let's talk about the artisans. The unsung Michelangelos of ancient China. These craftsmen transformed raw materials into objects of beauty and utility, whether it was delicate porcelain or intricate woodwork. Yet, much like their merchant counterparts, artisans were often relegated to the fringes of respectability. The reason? Their work, while essential, was considered manual labor, and in a society that held intellectual and agricultural pursuits in higher regard, that was a bit of a social faux pas. But here's the twist. Despite their social standing, artisans played a crucial role in cultural exchanges along the Silk Road. Their creations were in high demand, not just within China, but across the known world. Chinese porcelain, or white gold, as it was often called, found its way into the courts of Europe, and Chinese artisans were the unseen architects of global trade networks long before the term globalization was coined. They were the unseen forces behind the scenes, the anonymous architects of cross-cultural dialogue. Now, let's bust a myth about these craftsmen. While it's tempting to romanticize them as solitary geniuses toiling away in dusty workshops, the reality was more assembly line than art studio. Artisans often worked in guilds, each specializing in a particular craft, be it lacquerware or jade carving. These guilds functioned much like medieval trade unions, setting standards, prices, and even wages. It was organized chaos, sure, but it ensured that the quality of Chinese goods remained unparalleled. And let's not forget the economic context. While artisans and merchants were often looked down upon, they were integral to an economy that was as complex as it was vast. Trade routes like the Silk Road weren't just highways for goods, they were arteries of cultural exchange. Through these routes, China exported not just silk and porcelain, but ideas, technology, and even cuisine. The economic interplay was like a game of chess played on an imperial scale, with merchants and artisans maneuvering their pieces with strategic finesse. Despite their contributions, the social stigma persisted, a testament to the rigid hierarchy that defined ancient Chinese society. It was a world where your worth was often dictated by birth, not by merit, and where the ability to accumulate wealth was both admired and reviled. The merchants and artisans were the embodiment of this contradiction, navigating a society that valued their goods, but not always their presence. In the end, the narrative of ancient China's middlemen is one of duality, of prosperity and prejudice, of innovation and invisibility. They were the unsung architects of a civilization that thrived on the fruits of their labor, even if it was loath to admit it. As we continue this journey through the social strata of ancient China, remember that every silk robe and porcelain vase tells a story, not just of artistry, but of a complex web of human endeavor and ambition. So, as we wrap up this chapter on the merchants and artisans, keep an eye on the horizon. There's more to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more stories to tell as we delve deeper into the intricate tapestry of ancient China's social hierarchy. Stay tuned, dear listener, because the past is more than just a series of dates and names. It's a living, breathing narrative that's waiting to unfold. Ah, ancient China, where the silk is exquisite, the emperors are divine, and the soldiers, well, they're signing up for the ancient equivalent of a never-ending road trip, complete with arrows as party favors. You see, being a soldier in ancient China wasn't just about flexing military might. It was like joining a traveling circus of camaraderie, danger, and the occasional existential crisis. Let's dive into the military antics of this fascinating civilization. Now, you might think that soldiers were living the good life, what with the free travel and all, but hold your horses, literally, because the reality was more like an extended boot camp that doubled as a crash course in diplomacy, survival, and the fine art of not getting skewered. During the Han Dynasty, from 206 BC to 220 AD, military service was often compulsory, a civic duty that could last up to 2 years. And if you were lucky, or unlucky, depending on your perspective, You could end up stationed anywhere from the scorching deserts of the Silk Road to the freezing steppes of Mongolia. As for pay, let's just say it wasn't exactly making it rain. Soldiers were often compensated with land or food rather than coin, a practice that was as pragmatic as it was stingy. And speaking of pragmatism, let's debunk the myth of the disciplined warrior who never put a foot wrong. Sure, there were elite units like the Terracotta Army, those silent soldiers crafted to guard Emperor Qin Shi Huang in the afterlife. But the average foot soldier was more likely to be fighting boredom than barbarians, spending his days building fortifications or patrolling borders. Yet amidst the grind, soldiers were the Empire's unsung heroes, the ones who kept the barbarians at bay while ensuring the Empire's borders stayed intact. Their legacy, a testament to the human spirit's resilience and the indomitable will to persevere. Because let's face it, these guys were the original road warriors, long before Mad Max made it cool. And while their tales rarely make it into the grand narratives of history, their contributions were as vital as they were invisible. Now let's shift gears to the social outcasts, the folks who lived life on the fringes, where one wrong move could see you banished to the societal equivalent of Siberia. These were the people who occupied the lowest rungs of the social ladder, a world where being an outcast wasn't just a label, it was a life sentence. We're talking about slaves, convicts, and those who had the misfortune of being born into the wrong caste. Take the case of slaves, a group that was as diverse as it was disenfranchised. Slavery in ancient China wasn't based on race, but rather on circumstance. War captives, debtors, and even criminals could find themselves shackled in servitude. And while some slaves worked in households, others were laboring in mines or tilling fields, their lives dictated by the whims of their masters. It was an existence as bleak as it was brutal, a grim reminder that freedom was a luxury not everyone could afford. But here's a twist. While slavery was undeniably oppressive, there were instances where slaves could earn their freedom. Through loyalty, skill, or sheer luck, some managed to climb out of the abyss, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Yet, for every success story, there were countless others who remained trapped, their lives a harsh reflection of a society that thrived on hierarchy and subjugation. And let's not forget those who lived on the fringes by choice, or rather, by necessity. We're talking about the Giant Min, or mean people, a class of social outcasts that included entertainers, butchers, and gravediggers. These folks were seen as necessary evils, their professions tainted by superstition and stigma. Yet they played crucial roles in the social fabric, providing services that others shunned. Their reality was a paradox, a life of contradiction where they were both essential and ostracized. But why the stigma, you ask? The answer lies in a blend of superstition and social conservatism. Entertainers, for instance, were seen as morally dubious, their nomadic lifestyles and perceived lack of propriety putting them at odds with Confucian ideals. Butchers and gravediggers, meanwhile, were tainted by associations with death and impurity, their work seen as a necessary contamination of the otherwise harmonious social order. So what's the takeaway from this grand tableau of ancient China's social hierarchy? It's a complex mosaic, a tapestry woven with threads of power, ambition, and survival. From the top echelons of emperors and scholars to the uncelebrated ranks of soldiers and outcasts, each played a role in the grand drama of a civilization that spanned millennia. And while the myths often paint a picture of harmony and order, the reality was a perpetual balancing act, a dance of ambition and resilience that defined the human experience. In the end, ancient China's social hierarchy was as much about the stories we tell as it was about the realities we choose to acknowledge. It was a world where every silk robe, every imperial decree, every soldier's march, and every outcast's struggle told a story of endurance, of aspiration, and of the indomitable will to thrive against the odds. So as you drift off into the embrace of sleep, remember this. History is more than just a collection of dates and events. It's a living, breathing narrative that invites us to learn, to question, and to marvel at the complexities of the human condition. Sweet dreams, fellow time traveler, and may your journey through history be as enlightening as it is engaging. So, you're about to embark on the glamorous life of a medieval knight's squire. Ha! Well, buckle up, because you're in for a reality check that might just have you reconsidering your life choices. Forget the shining armor and noble quests. This isn't your bedtime story, my friend. At the ripe age of 14, say goodbye to the comforts of home and hello to a world where you're more likely to end up knee-deep in horse dung than in a nightly romance. First off, let's dive into your morning routine, which, spoiler alert, isn't exactly like waking up in a feudal spa. Your day kicks off before the crack of dawn, around 4 a.m. You might think, the early bird gets the worm. But here, the early squire gets the broom. Your first task, cleaning the stables. That's right, the romantic nightly duties start with you shoveling manure. And you better do it fast, because a knight who waits for his horse is a knight who might not wait for his squire. After the mucking out, it's time for breakfast. But don't get too excited. Forget about your morning latte and croissant. You'll be lucky if you get a chunk of stale bread and a sliver of cheese. Maybe some pottage if you're living the high life. And this is all washed down with a weak ale because, let's face it, medieval water wasn't exactly known for its sparkling clarity. Next up, it's time to learn the fine art of weapon maintenance. The sword, you see, is the knight's best friend, and as a squire, you're responsible for making sure it's always ready to slice and dice. You'll spend hours sharpening blades, oiling armor, and making sure every piece of equipment is polished to perfection. And trust me, there's no room for error. A rusty sword could mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield, and no one wants to be the squire who lets Sir Clankalart down. Now, let's talk about training. If you thought gym class was tough, welcome to Squire Boot Camp. This isn't just a few push-ups and laps around the field. We're talking relentless physical training to build the endurance and strength needed for battle. You'll practice with wooden swords until you can barely lift your arms, run drills in full armor until your legs give out, and learn to ride a horse like you're auditioning for a medieval rodeo. And don't even get me started on jousting practice. In theory, you're learning to knock an opponent off their horse with a giant stick. In practice, you're learning how to fall off a horse without breaking your neck. While you're busy with all this, let's not forget you're also expected to learn the knightly virtues. Chivalry sounds great in tales and songs, but in reality, it's a set of rules designed to keep you in line. Sure, there's the bit about being brave and courteous, but don't overlook the finer details like absolute loyalty to your lord, which often means doing whatever he says, no questions asked. And the whole idea of romance, let's just say courtly love, was more about poetry and less about actual affection. In case you're wondering if there's any downtime, think again. When you're not training or cleaning or running errands, you're following your knight around like a medieval PA, taking notes, fetching things, and making sure his every whim is catered to. All this while trying to learn from him, hoping to one day become a knight yourself. It's like The Apprentice meets Game of Thrones, except there's no boardroom and a lot more mud. But hey, it's not all grim. There's a certain camaraderie among squires, a sense of brotherhood forged in shared hardship. And the skills you learn, though hard-earned, are invaluable. From mastering the art of combat to understanding the complexities of feudal politics, being a squire prepares you for the chaotic world of the Middle Ages like nothing else. And there you have it, the not-so-glamorous life of a squire. It's a tough gig, but if you survive the muck, the sweat, and the endless chores, you might just have what it takes to become a knight, or at least have some good stories to tell at the medieval tavern. But hold your horses, or at least the one you're tirelessly tending to. Before you start dreaming of that silver-plated knightly upgrade, let's talk about the economics of squiredom. Spoiler, it's less of a golden ticket and more of a financial high-wire act that would make Wall Street look like amateur hour. You see, becoming a knight wasn't just a matter of valor or bravado. It was a bona fide financial gamble, a medieval version of go big or go home. First off, let's talk armor. We're not talking about some off-the-rack chainmail from the old medieval mart. Nope, a decent suit of armor could cost up to £40, a sum that would take a skilled craftsman years to earn. That's like buying a luxury sports car today. And just like a sports car, if you wanted all the bells and whistles, like a custom design or extra protection, you'd better be prepared to shell out even more. As a squire dreaming of the knighthood, you needed a warhorse or destrier, which wasn't your average pony, more like the medieval equivalent of battle tank. A good destrier could cost the same as a small castle. Yes, you heard that right. So, unless you had a family with deep pockets or a particularly generous lord, becoming a knight was as much about affording it as it was about earning it. Then there's the matter of training. You think modern education is expensive. Try learning the art of chivalry. The training period was like an extended unpaid internship, except your job was to ensure that Sir Lancelot had his armor polished and his sword sharper than his wit. And let's not forget the social stakes. Much like today's cutthroat corporate ladder, medieval society required you to network. It was all about who you knew, or rather, who your lord knew. Without the right connections, all the armor and horses in the world wouldn't get you across the proverbial drawbridge. If you were born the third son of a minor noble, congratulations. You just won a one-way ticket to Squireville, because your older brothers likely snagged any inheritance worth having. But even if you were from a more modest background, the dream of knighthood was tantalizing. It promised upward mobility in a world where social climbing was about as easy as scaling a castle wall in full plate armor. The stakes were high, but so were the potential rewards: land, glory, and a seat at the high table. The feudal system was a rigid hierarchy, and your place in it was as fixed as the stars, or at least that's how it seemed. But there was always the hope that, with enough grit and a little luck, you could shuffle your social cards and end up with a winning hand. It was a world obsessed with honor and loyalty, where your reputation could make or break you faster than a jousting lance on a bad day. And speaking of lances, let's not forget the constant peril of battle. If you did make it to knighthood, you weren't just donning armor for the medieval catwalk. Life on the battlefield was brutal and short. The 100 Years' War, for example, was less of a historical footnote and more of an ongoing calamity. In the 14th century, if you survived the Black Death, your next challenge was dodging arrows at Angkor or hacking your way through the chaos at Crecy. Yet, for all its risks and costs, the life of a knight was a ticket to the kind of adventure that today we'd only find in video games or blockbuster movies. The romance of it all, the quest for glory, the chance to have your deeds sung by minstrels, held an irresistible allure. But make no mistake, the path to knighthood was strewn with financial pitfalls, social snags, and more than a few literal battles. And just like that, the dream of the Round Table takes a back seat to the harsh reality of medieval economics. Because in this game, valor was only part of the equation. Money talked, and if you could listen closely enough, it might just guide you to the castle gates, or leave you stranded in the stables. As you ponder your next move, remember, in this world, fortune favors the well-armored. And speaking of fortune favoring the well-armored, let's delve into the real-life Game of Thrones that was medieval Europe. Because while you're busy dreaming of knighthood, sharpening swords, and oiling armor, you're also a living, breathing pawn on the political chessboard of the time. And trust me, this isn't the kind of chess where you can pop off for a coffee break. So, what's the deal with squires and politics? For starters, you're not just learning to swing a sword for the sake of it. No, every swing, every joust, every clumsy tumble off a horse is preparing you for a role in the grand political theater where alliances were as fickle as today's celebrity relationships. Think of it like this. Medieval Europe was the original soap opera, complete with dramatic betrayals, strategic marriages, and enough plot twists to make your head spin. Let's talk alliances. Picture your lord as the medieval CEO and his vassals, the knights and their squires, as a mix of interns and junior executives. Now, this feudal company is constantly trying to merge, acquire, or sometimes outright hostile take over neighboring estates. Your training isn't just about personal glory. It's about ensuring your lord comes out on top, or at least doesn't end up headless. And don't let the tales of gallant knights in shining armor fool you. This was a cutthroat world where loyalty was more about survival than honor. Take, for instance, the infamous Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD, where the grandsons of Charlemagne decided that Europe was too big for just one family to squabble over. They carved up the empire like it was Thanksgiving turkey, creating the geopolitical jigsaw puzzle that squires like you would have to navigate centuries later. Your lord's allegiance could shift faster than you could say feudal obligations. And as a squire, you were right in the thick of it. Now, let's tackle the matrimonial side of things. If you thought royal weddings were extravagant today, you haven't seen anything until you've witnessed medieval Europe's version of Tinder. Strategic marriages were the glue holding alliances together, and you, dear squire, were often the unlucky courier delivering those love letters, or more likely, dowry negotiations. Marriages were less about romance and more about land, power, and occasionally peace treaties. Your lord's daughter marrying the neighboring duke's son could mean the difference between war and a very awkward family reunion. And speaking of wars, every conflict you trained for was a direct result of these political machinations. The 100 Years' War, for example, wasn't just about England and France arguing over who got to wear the crown. It was a tangled web of claims, counterclaims, and a lot of angry nobility with too much time and not enough Netflix to distract them. As a squire, your role was to support your knight, who might be fighting not just for his life, but for the ever-shifting boundaries of his lord's lands. But let's not forget the Crusades. Ah, the Crusades, medieval Europe's version of a world tour, except with more armor and less sightseeing. These religious campaigns were the ultimate expression of political and spiritual aspirations, and you, as a squire, were smack dab in the middle of it. The call to arms was as much about piety as it was about politics, with popes and kings promising eternal salvation and earthly rewards in equal measure. For a young squire, participating in a crusade was the medieval equivalent of backpacking through Europe, except you were more likely to return with scars than souvenirs. And while we're on the topic of scars, let's not romanticize the battlefield too much. The reality was a cacophony of clashing steel, thundering hooves, and the ever-present stench of fear. Forget the Hollywood battles with heroic speeches and neatly choreographed sword fights. In truth, medieval warfare was chaotic, bloody, and often decided by which side had the fewer cases of dysentery. Your training as a squire had to prepare you for this brutal reality, because surviving a battle was as much about luck as it was about skill. Now, despite all these challenges, the allure of knighthood remained strong. The promise of land, titles, and a place in history was enough to keep many a squire shoveling manure with dreams in their eyes. But make no mistake, the path was fraught with peril, both from outside enemies and the treacherous politics within your own court. Alliances could crumble overnight, leaving you vulnerable to the whims of power-hungry nobles. Yet, amidst all the chaos, there was a strange sort of order. The feudal system, for all its flaws, created a world where everyone knew their place and their duties. As a squire, you were being groomed not just for battle, but to understand the intricate dance of loyalty and power that defined medieval life. And while the romantic image of the knight may have been more myth than reality, it was this very myth that drove the ambitions of countless squires, fueling their desire to rise above the muck and mire of their station. So there you have it, the political landscape that you're navigating as a squire. It's a world where your every move is dictated by the ambitions and alliances of those above you. But if you play your cards right, you might just find yourself not just surviving but thriving in this medieval power play. Just remember, in this game, it's all about who you know, who you owe, and who owes you. And maybe, just maybe, you'll earn your place at the round table, or at least a cushy spot in the castle hall. And speaking of living in the shadow of power, let's dive into the psychological pressures of squire life. Because if you thought shoveling manure was tough, try doing it under the crushing weight of medieval expectations. You see, being a squire was like living in a high-stakes reality show where the prize wasn't just a rose or $1 million, but your entire social standing and future career. Talk about pressure. First up, let's tackle the myth of honor and chivalry. Ah, the knightly code. A set of ideals so shiny they could blind you faster than a polished suit of armor. But here's the kicker. Chivalry wasn't really about rescuing damsels or slaying dragons. Nope, it was more a medieval PR campaign than a genuine moral compass. Historical texts like the Song of Roland painted knights as paragons of virtue. But in reality, these codes were about as flexible as a wet noodle. Chivalry was a mixed bag of religious devotion, martial prowess, and courtly manners, which, if we're being honest, probably felt like juggling flaming swords while reciting poetry. Sure, knights were expected to protect the weak and uphold justice, but when push came to shove, these ideals often crumbled under the weight of war and politics. It was less about being a hero and more about not getting yourself killed, or worse, dishonored. Consider the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where the English longbowmen famously decimated the French knights. In this clash, chivalry was less about fair play and more about brutal efficiency. Henry V didn't win by being the nicest guy on the battlefield. He won by using tactics that would have made Machiavelli proud. The romanticized knightly valor, not so much. It was more a case of survive by any means necessary. Now, let's talk about the mental toll of constant preparedness for war. Imagine living in a state of perpetual readiness, where every day is a potential last day. It's like being a contestant on a never-ending episode of Survivor, but instead of tribal councils, you face real, life-threatening battles. The stress would be enough to make anyone crack, and for squires, the stakes were as high as their anxiety levels. The constant drills, the endless weapon maintenance, the looming spectre of actual combat, it all took a psychological toll that could make the strongest mind waver. And while knights had their armor and swords, squires had to armor themselves with resilience and hope. Because let's face it, the medieval battlefield wasn't a place for the faint-hearted or the contemplative. But why, you ask, did they keep going? Why toil through the muck and danger for a chance at knighthood? Well, that's where the allure of propaganda comes in. Tales of valor and glory were the medieval equivalent of viral TikToks. They spread fast and left a lasting impression. Minstrels and troubadours, the social media influencers of their day, would sing of epic battles and noble feats, painting knights as larger-than-life figures. And who wouldn't want a piece of that fame? But here's the thing. These tales were often exaggerated or entirely fabricated, designed to boost morale or justify wars. Take the stories of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. While they inspired generations, historians like Geoffrey of Monmouth were more storytellers than reporters. The romantic image of the knight was a carefully curated brand, one that overlooked the harsh realities of medieval life. In truth, the path to knighthood was riddled with pitfalls, both mental and physical. Surviving the ride meant navigating not just the battlefield, but also the labyrinth of expectations and propaganda. But for those squires who managed to ascend to knighthood, the rewards were worth the struggle. Land, titles, and most importantly, stories that would echo through the ages. So, as you ponder the life of a squire, remember that beneath the armor and the tales of chivalry lies a world of complexity and contradiction. It's a world where ideals clashed with reality, where the quest for honor often led down darker paths than the songs would have you believe. And while the dream of knighthood was a powerful motivator, the journey was as much about survival as it was about valor. As we continue down this winding road, keep in mind that the squire's life was a crucible of pressure, myth, and reality, a true test of grit in a world where the stakes were as high as the castles they served. And who knows, maybe by the end of it, you'll have a newfound appreciation for the modern conveniences of pizza delivery and streaming services. Because, let's be real, the only thing a squire could stream back then was the local creek. And speaking of medieval creeks and the flow of history, let's dive headfirst into the legacy of the squire's journey to knighthood, a path as winding as the castle moats they once guarded. It's time to reflect on how these roles have shaped our modern perceptions of honor and duty. Spoiler alert, it's a mixed bag of noble ideals and gritty realities. First, let's talk about the transformation from squire to knight, a journey that was less about fairy tale metamorphosis and more about surviving a gauntlet of challenges that would make a reality TV producer drool. The squire's path was one of relentless toil, a daily grind that involved more muck and less magic than the stories would have you believe. Yet, it was this very grind that forged the character and skills necessary for the knighthood. Think of it as medieval boot camp with a side of chivalric charm. Now, fast forward to today, and you'll find that the romanticized vision of knighthood still holds a certain appeal. We love our tales of gallant heroes riding to the rescue, swords gleaming in the sun. Movies and books still cash in on this trope, much like the troubadours of old, spinning stories of valor and virtue. But let's not kid ourselves. The reality was often more mundane. The squires were the unsung heroes, the backstage crew making sure the show went on without a hitch. They were the ones who scrubbed the armor, trained tirelessly, and bore the brunt of battlefield chaos. Without them, the knight's shine would have been a lot less. Well, shiny. The legacy of the squire's journey is also a testament to the power of perseverance. These young men were taught that success didn't come from a single act of bravery, but from years of dedication and hard work. It's a lesson that transcends time and remains relevant today, whether you're climbing the corporate ladder or simply trying to make it through a particularly grueling gym session. The spirit of the squire lives on. It's about putting in the hours, showing up even when you'd rather not, and understanding that glory is often built on the unglamorous foundations of sweat and grit. And while we're on the topic of sweat and grit, let's not forget the economic context that shaped this journey. The path to knighthood wasn't just about swinging swords. It was also about navigating a world where money talked and poverty walked. As a squire, you were expected to fund your own training and equipment, a medieval version of paying your dues. The disparity in wealth often determined who could afford to pursue the knightly dream, a stark reminder that even noble aspirations were subject to economic realities. Yet, despite the financial hurdles and societal pressures, the allure of knighthood was undeniable. It promised not just personal glory, but also a chance to break through the rigid social hierarchy of the time. In a world where your birth often dictated your fate, the role of a knight offered a rare opportunity for social mobility. It was a tantalizing dream, one that kept many a squire shoveling manure with hope in their hearts. So, what does all this mean for us today? Well, the romantic image of the knight endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the desire for honor, duty, and courage. We may not be donning armor or charging into battle on horseback, but the ideals remain relevant. In our modern world, they manifest in different forms, from the soldier on the front lines to the activist fighting for justice. The core values of knighthood, bravery, loyalty, and service, are timeless, even if the context has changed. But let's not get too misty-eyed. The reality check here is that the true story of knighthood is a complex tapestry woven with threads of myth and reality. The journey from squire to knight was grueling and fraught with challenges, a testament to the resilience and determination required to navigate a world that was as harsh as it was beautiful. It's a reminder that every shining armor has its dents, and every tale of glory has its untold backstory. In conclusion, the legacy of the squire's journey is a multifaceted one. It challenges us to look beyond the romanticized narratives and appreciate the gritty realities of medieval life. These young men were more than just sidekicks to their knights. They were the backbone of the chivalric system, the unsung heroes who laid the groundwork for the legends we celebrate today. Their story is one of perseverance, resilience, and the timeless quest for honor, a journey that, in many ways, mirrors our own modern struggles. And as you tuck yourself into bed, perhaps with visions of armored knights and gallant quests dancing in your head, remember this. The true adventure lies not just in the destination, but in the journey itself. So, whether you're a modern-day squire or just someone grappling with the challenges of everyday life, take heart. The path may be tough, but it is also rich with lessons that echo through the ages. As the squires of old would tell you, the road to knighthood is paved with grit, determination, and a healthy dose of reality. Sleep well, noble dreamers, for tomorrow brings another chance to forge your own legend. So there you are, crammed shoulder to shoulder with your fellow pilgrims, not because you're a fan of cozy spaces, but because the winds of change have been a little too breezy back in England. It's the early 1600, and the air is thick with more than just the fog off the Thames. It's filled with religious intolerance, economic uncertainty, and the tantalizing rumors of a new world ripe for the taking. Now, let's set the record straight. The notion that pilgrims were simply adventure seekers with a penchant for roughing it in the wilderness is about as accurate as saying the Mayflower was a luxury cruise liner. Nope, this was no pleasure jaunt. The driving force, religious freedom, or rather, the lack of it. You see, England under King James, wasn't exactly a bastion of tolerance. Our pilgrim buddies, part of a group known as separatists, wanted the freedom to worship without the meddling of the Church of England. Picture a church service where the preacher is more focused on the monarch's whims than on spiritual matters. Yeah, not exactly the vibe they were going for. But the religious scene was just one part of the equation. Economic pressures were squeezing harder than a Tudor corset. By 1620, England's economic outlook was as dreary as its weather. Overpopulation, inflation, and a failing agricultural system made life about as comfortable as a bed of nails. So, you've got this group of folks who are religiously dissatisfied and financially strapped. What's the logical next step? Well, if you're a pilgrim, you start eyeing the horizon for new opportunities. The new world. Now there's a phrase that had them dreaming. It wasn't just the idea of worshipping freely that was attractive. There were also tales of vast lands and resources. For a group struggling to make ends meet, the prospect of land ownership was like a siren call. Land meant stability, security, and the chance to build a community free from persecution. But dreams, as you might know, come with a price tag. Enter the financial gymnastics of the early 17th century. Raising funds for the journey was less about bake sales and more about backroom deals and risky loans. Imagine trying to convince investors to fund a one-way ticket to a land many still believed was populated by monsters and mythical beasts. Not exactly a sure bet. The Pilgrims formed a joint stock company with some sympathetic investors, known as the Merchant Adventurers. These folks were the venture capitalists of their day, willing to take a gamble on this ragtag group in exchange for a cut of whatever profits might come from the new colony. It was a bit like Shark Tank, but with more beards and fewer snazzy suits. The deal was this. The Pilgrims would work for the company for 7 years, after which time they'd share profits. Sounds straightforward, until you realize they had to secure a ship, supplies, and provisions, all while dodging the prying eyes of the authorities. Securing the Mayflower was no small feat. It wasn't some shiny new vessel, but an aging cargo ship, built in 1609, and more accustomed to hauling wine than wannabe settlers. This 100-foot-long tub would be home to 102 passengers, and a crew of about 30 for a journey that could take anywhere from 6 weeks to several months, depending on the whims of the Atlantic. And let's talk numbers. The cost of chartering the Mayflower was around £100 a month, a hefty sum considering the average annual wage was about £10. And before they could set sail, there was the small matter of leaving England without drawing too much attention. The Pilgrims had already tried escaping to the Netherlands in 1608, a move that was about as smooth as a cobblestone road. They were caught, imprisoned, and eventually released, only to make another attempt to reach the more tolerant Dutch shores. There, they lived for a decade in Leiden, but economic hardships persisted, and the cultural barriers were stifling. It was clear that the Netherlands was merely a pit stop on the way to something greater. Back in England, clandestine meetings were the order of the day. Picture a roomful of earnest faces, low voices murmuring over maps and ledgers, the flickering light of a candle casting shadows of doubt and hope alike. They were not just planning a voyage, they were plotting a future. And with each whispered conversation, the dream of the new world seemed a little closer. But let's not sugarcoat it. This was no epic adventure with a guaranteed happy ending. The harsh reality was that many saw this journey as a one-way ticket. Returning to England would not only be financially impossible, but also spiritually inconceivable. They were burning bridges, both metaphorically and quite possibly literally, as they set their sights westward. As the final days in England slipped away, the Pilgrims faced the sobering reality of what they were leaving behind. Family, friends, the familiar rhythms of life. Yet the pull of the unknown was irresistible. It's easy to imagine them standing on the dock, the Mayflower looming large, its timbers creaking as if whispering secrets of the sea. They were taking a leap of faith, not just for themselves, but for the generations that would follow. And while the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, it was a path they were determined to tread. So, as you stand there, surrounded by your fellow travelers, each heart beating with a mix of trepidation and hope, you realize you're not just passengers on a ship. You're pioneers of a new chapter in history. The Mayflower may not be the most glamorous vessel, but it carries with it the weight of dreams, the burden of fears, and the promise of a new beginning. The journey is just beginning, and who's to say what awaits on the other side? But one thing is certain. The story of the Pilgrims and their quest for freedom is one that will echo through the ages, long after the Mayflower has sailed into legend. And so, with the creaking of ropes and the nervous chatter of 102 souls echoing in the chilly dawn, the Mayflower finally slipped away from the English coast, setting a course that would rewrite history, or at least scrawl a pretty chaotic chapter in its margins. Now, if you're picturing a scene of serene, sunlit sails gliding across a glassy ocean, hold that thought and then toss it overboard. This was the North Atlantic, after all, where the weather has more mood swings than a soap opera protagonist. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of life aboard this 17th century equivalent of a sardine can. The Mayflower was about 100 feet long and 25 feet wide, which sounds spacious until you realize it was crammed with people, supplies, and livestock. The passengers were mostly tucked away in the 'tween deck, a dim, claustrophobic space with a ceiling so low that even the shortest among them had to stoop. Privacy, forget it. Personal space. When you're sharing a ship with over 100 people, the concept of personal anything becomes a distant memory. And then there's the smell. Imagine a blend of unwashed bodies, stagnant seawater, and whatever culinary crimes were being committed in the galley. Hygiene standards back then were as loose as a poorly tied knot. Bathing wasn't exactly a priority, partly because fresh water was too precious to waste on such frivolities. The Pilgrims' idea of a refreshing wash was a brisk sea breeze and a splash of salt water, basically nature's own exfoliant. Germs, meet your new best friends. Speaking of culinary delights, let's chat about the menu. If you're expecting a buffet of exotic seafare, prepare to be disappointed. The daily diet was a monotonous parade of hardtack, dried peas, salted meat, and fish. Hardtack, for the uninitiated, is basically a cracker that's been petrified into an inedible brick. Think of it as the ancestor of the gluten-free snack. Throw in some beer, which was safer to drink than water, and you've got a meal that would make even the most enthusiastic foodie lose their appetite. But hey, at least they weren't going to die of dehydration. Amidst all this, the Pilgrims had to contend with the Atlantic's infamous temperament. The ocean was a cantankerous beast, lashing the ship with waves that towered like soggy skyscrapers. On more than one occasion, it seemed as if the Mayflower might meet its end at the bottom of Davy Jones' locker. But the ship was sturdy, and so were its occupants. When a fierce storm cracked one of the main beams, they didn't panic. They improvised, using a large iron screw, a piece of machinery brought along for potential construction in the New World. They managed to secure the beam and keep the vessel seaworthy. Talk about DIY under pressure. Seasickness was the unwelcome guest that overstayed its welcome, claiming the stomachs of many who dared to look out over the churning waters. If you've ever been on a cruise and felt a little queasy, imagine that sensation multiplied by 10 with no Dramamine in sight. The lucky ones who managed to keep their meals down might have felt like heroes, but even they weren't immune to the endless rocking and rolling. Now, life on the Mayflower wasn't all misery and malnutrition. There were moments of levity and human connection. You see, adversity has a funny way of bringing people together, or driving them apart, depending on the day. The Pilgrims and the crew of the Mayflower had their share of spats, fueled by cultural differences and the stress of the voyage. The crew, seasoned sailors who probably saw the Pilgrims as naive dreamers, didn't always appreciate the newcomers' pious ways. Meanwhile, the Pilgrims, with their lofty ideals, sometimes viewed the crew's rough-and-tumble behavior as less than savory. But necessity breeds cooperation, and both parties knew they had to work together to survive. And survive they did, for 66 grueling days. On November 9, 1620, the cry of "Land Ho!" finally rang out, sending a ripple of relief through the weary travelers. You might think they'd fetch up at their intended destination of Virginia, but in true Mayflower fashion, the ship had other ideas. They were off course, landing in what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts. GPS was a few centuries away after all. So there they were, staring at the unfamiliar shores of New England, their dreams of the New World slowly taking shape in the misty air. The journey wasn't over yet, but they'd made it across the Atlantic, a feat that was as audacious as it was arduous. The Mayflower's voyage had been far from the romanticized tale of brave pioneers sailing into the sunset. It was a test of endurance, a battle against the elements, and a testament to the human spirit's capacity to dream beyond the horizon. And while the Mayflower may have sailed into legend, the real story was anything but smooth sailing. So, you'd think the Pilgrims would be ready to kiss the sandy shores in gratitude and start singing, "Onward, Christian soldiers," but hold your horses, or rather your oxen, because there was a catch. They weren't exactly where they planned to be. The intended target was the mouth of the Hudson River in Virginia territory, but thanks to navigational hiccups and a few storms that had more attitude than a teenager with a curfew, they ended up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. You know, just a few hundred miles off course. No biggie, right? Well, it was a biggie. The Pilgrims found themselves in a legal no-man's land, quite literally. They had a patent to establish a colony in Virginia, not in this frost-bitten corner of the New World. That meant they had no official right to be there, and without legal authority, anarchy was just a short step away. Picture the scene. 102 weary passengers stepping onto the New England soil, realizing they had two choices: pull together or fall apart. It was like the original reality show, Survivor, Cape Cod. Now, let's talk about the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims' very own Plan B. Drafted in the cramped quarters of the Mayflower, this document was less about high-minded ideals and more about keeping heads from rolling. It was a simple agreement to establish a civil body politic, which is 17th century speak. We're going to make some rules so we don't end up fighting each other more than we fight the elements. Signed by 41 of the ship's male passengers on November 11, 1620, this compact was a pragmatic move to quell any whispers of mutiny and prevent the social fabric from unraveling faster than a cheap sweater. Think of it as Democracy 101, with a side of survival instincts. But let's not romanticize this into a declaration of independence moment. This was a straightforward, no-nonsense contract, not a lofty proclamation of freedom. The compact's real genius lay in its brevity and practicality. It was a legal band-aid slapped on a potentially festering wound, holding the group together until they could establish a more permanent governance structure. With the ink, or whatever passed for ink back then, still drying, the Pilgrims faced the next hurdle, setting up shop in a place that wasn't even on their original itinerary. The landscape of Cape Cod was as welcoming as a porcupine in a petting zoo. The sandy soil wasn't exactly fertile farmland, and the approaching winter threatened to turn their colonial dreams into a frosty nightmare. The first order of business: find a suitable location for their settlement before the chill set in and made their stay less of a New World adventure and more of an ice-bound endurance test. The Pilgrims embarked on a series of exploratory missions, trekking through forests and marshes in search of a site with the right mix of resources. By December, they settled on Plymouth, a spot with a good harbor, fresh water, and cleared fields, left behind by Native Americans who had been decimated by disease years earlier. It's one of history's darker ironies. The Pilgrims' good fortune was built on the tragedy of others. The cleared land made their task a little easier, but let's not kid ourselves. It was still a Herculean effort to build a new settlement from scratch. As the settlers started constructing their new homes, they faced the harsh realities of colonial life. Building materials didn't just fall out of the sky, and the first winter was brutal. Over half of the original Mayflower passengers didn't survive to see spring. Cold, disease, and malnutrition took a heavy toll, and the dream of the New World quickly turned into a grim struggle for survival. It's the kind of sobering detail that often gets glossed over in the sanitized versions of history. And then there were the neighbors, Native American tribes who had been living in the region long before the Pilgrims decided to drop anchor. Initial encounters were tense, a mix of curiosity and caution on both sides. It wasn't until March 1621 that the Pilgrims made significant contact with the Wampanoag people, led by Chief Massasoit. This relationship would prove crucial for the settlers' survival, but let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't a heartwarming Disney tale of friendship. It was a strategic alliance born out of necessity. The Wampanoag, weakened by disease and wary of hostile tribes, saw the Pilgrims as potential allies. Meanwhile, the settlers desperately needed help to make it through another winter. Enter Squanto, a member of the Patuxet tribe who had a story worthy of a Hollywood script. Kidnapped by English traders years before and sold into slavery in Spain, Squanto eventually found his way back to his homeland, only to find his tribe wiped out by disease. He became a critical go-between, teaching the Pilgrims how to plant corn, fish, and tap the local resources. Without his guidance, the fledgling colony might have fizzled out faster than you can say Thanksgiving turkey. Now, we could spend hours unraveling the complex web of interactions between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, but let's save that for another day. For now, it's enough to note that the Pilgrims' survival was as much about diplomacy as it was about grit and determination. They were thrust into a world where every decision carried the weight of life and death, where alliances were forged out of necessity, and where the romanticized version of colonial life was as far from reality as the Mayflower was from its intended destination. So, as the Pilgrims huddled in their newly built homes, surrounded by the harsh beauty of the New England landscape, they must have wondered what the future held. The Mayflower Compact had kept them together, but the real work, the building of a new society, was just beginning. They had crossed an ocean, faced down storms and starvation, and now stood on the threshold of an uncertain future. The story of the Pilgrims is far from over, and as history marches on, we'll see how this small group of settlers navigated the unpredictable tides of change. But for now, they were simply trying to survive another day, one step at a time. And as the Pilgrims peered out at the frosty expanse of New England, they were about to learn that the new world had all the harshness of the old, plus a few extra surprises. Winter had arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, and the settlers quickly discovered that surviving in this new land was less about manifest destiny and more about raw grit and sheer stubbornness. Let's not mince words. The first winter was brutal. The Pilgrims were ill-prepared, armed with little more than hope and some seriously outdated English farming techniques. Imagine trying to coax crops from the stony, frozen ground while the wind howls through your half-built shelters, making your humble abode feel more like a glorified icebox. By January, the reality of their situation hit harder than a dropped anchor. Food was scarce, and the spectre of starvation loomed larger with each passing day. Supplies dwindled faster than you could say, harvest festival, and the settlers found themselves rationing their meager reserves of corn and salt pork like misers counting their last coins. Disease also played its grim hand, sweeping through the colony with the efficiency of a well-oiled war machine. The cramped, unsanitary conditions were a breeding ground for illnesses like scurvy and pneumonia, and the settlers dropped like flies. By the end of that winter, only about 50 of the original 102 Mayflower passengers remained. It's a staggering statistic that underscores the harsh reality of colonial life, a stark contrast to the rosy images often painted by history books. But let's not forget the human element amidst all these numbers and facts. The Pilgrims were not just statistics. They were fathers, mothers, children, each with dreams and fears, each fighting to survive another day. Their resilience was remarkable, but they were also painfully aware that they needed help, and fast. Enter the Wampanoag tribe, whose assistance was not just helpful but downright life-saving. Led by Chief Massasoit, the Wampanoag watched the struggling settlers with a mix of curiosity and caution. They were savvy enough to recognize that this bedraggled group of Europeans could be potential allies, or at the very least, a buffer against rival tribes. The Wampanoag's decision to extend the olive branch was as strategic as it was generous. Let's give a nod here to Squanto, the unsung hero of this narrative. His ability to bridge the cultural and linguistic gap between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was nothing short of miraculous. Teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. Or in this case, show the Pilgrims how to fertilize crops with fish, and you stave off starvation. Thanks to Squanto's guidance, the settlers learned to cultivate corn, beans, and squash, laying the groundwork for their future survival. Now, about that Thanksgiving feast. Time to wade into myth-busting territory. The iconic image of Pilgrims and Native Americans gathered around a bountiful table, sharing turkey and pumpkin pie, is as much a creation of 19th century nostalgia as it is historical fact. The real story, well, it's a bit more humble. The first shared meal in the fall of 1621 was likely a pragmatic affair, born from a successful harvest and the Pilgrims' gratitude for their newfound allies. It was a 3-day event, with the Wampanoag contributing venison and the Pilgrims offering up whatever they could muster. Turkey might have been on the menu, but it was far from the star attraction. This feast wasn't an official Thanksgiving, as we think of it today. It was more of an impromptu celebration of survival. There were no decorative gourds, no quaint harvest decor, just a simple acknowledgement of making it through the year without losing more lives. The notion of Thanksgiving as a national holiday wouldn't take shape until much later, but the seeds of the tradition were planted in that moment of gratitude and relief. The relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was complex, layered with mutual benefit, but also tinged with underlying tension. It was a fragile peace, built on the understanding that cooperation was essential for survival. The Wampanoag's decision to assist the settlers was a calculated risk, a strategic move in the chess game of survival in a rapidly changing world. For the Pilgrims, this alliance was nothing short of a lifeline. As spring rolled around, the settlers shook off the frost and threw themselves into the task of building a sustainable community. The harsh lessons of the previous winter were etched into their collective memory, driving them to fortify their settlement against future hardships. The Pilgrims' determination to thrive in this new land was as relentless as the Atlantic waves that had brought them here. Yet, even as they forged new paths, the specter of the past lingered. The Pilgrims carried with them the weight of loss, the memories of those who hadn't survived the journey or the winter. Each new day was a testament to their resilience, a reminder that the price of their dreams was steep but not insurmountable. In the end, the Pilgrims' first year in the New World was a testament to the human spirit's tenacity. It was a mosaic of struggle, hope, and unexpected alliances, an imperfect story that defies the simplicity of legend. As they stood on the brink of a new chapter, the Pilgrims were more than just survivors. They were the architects of a future they could scarcely imagine. And as history would show, their journey was far from over, with trials and triumphs yet to come. But let's not get too cozy with the idea of the Pilgrims as the forebears of American resilience, without acknowledging the complex legacy they left behind. The Mayflower voyage wasn't just a chapter in a textbook. It was the prologue to a centuries-long saga of cultural exchanges, conflicts, and the relentless march of colonial expansion. The Pilgrim story is less about a peaceful coexistence and more about a tumultuous relationship with the land and its original inhabitants, a relationship that would set the stage for future interactions between settlers and Native Americans. First, let's talk economics, because nothing says, "Welcome to the New World," quite like the harsh realities of supply and demand. The Pilgrims, despite their spiritual aspirations, quickly realized that piety did not pay the bills. The early years of the Plymouth colony were a lesson in survival economics. They had to turn their newfound skills in agriculture, courtesy of Squanto, into a sustainable economy. Corn became their cash crop, and the settlers learned to trade with both Native Americans and other European settlers. By the mid-1620s, they were exporting fur, fish, and lumber as well, transforming their fledgling community into an economic entity that could stand on its own 2 feet, or at least wobble a bit less precariously. But let's not kid ourselves into thinking this was an economic miracle. The colony's financial success was built on hard labor and the exploitation of resources, both natural and human. The Pilgrims' initial agreement with the merchant adventurers, a 7-year indenture, remember, meant that profits were initially directed back to their investors in England. It took until 1627 for the Pilgrims to buy out their contract, finally gaining some financial independence. Even then, economic stability was a constant struggle, a delicate balance of trade, agriculture, and negotiation. It was less rags to riches, and more rags to slightly less tattered rags, but it was progress nonetheless. And while we're on the subject of progress, let's take a moment to dissect the relationships with their Native American neighbors. If you're envisioning a harmonious blend of cultures, think again. The reality was a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting power dynamics. The initial peace treaty with the Wampanoag was less a utopian dream and more a strategic necessity for both parties. The Pilgrims needed allies to survive. The Wampanoag needed support against rival tribes. But as the colony expanded, so did tensions. Land disputes became more frequent, and the settlers' growing population put pressure on resources. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came decades later in the form of King Philip's War, a bloody conflict that erupted in 1675 between English settlers and a coalition of Native American tribes led by Metacomet, also known as King Philip. This war was one of the deadliest per capita in American history, decimating both the Native American population and the colonial settlers. It was a grim testament to the unsustainable nature of the settlers' expansion and the fragile nature of their alliances. The Pilgrims' legacy, then, is not just one of survival and religious freedom, but also one of conflict and colonization, a duality often glossed over in the sanitized tales of America's founding. Now, let's tackle the myth-making, because, oh boy, have the Pilgrims been put through the historical PR ringer. The romanticized image of the Pilgrims as the founding fathers of American democracy and freedom is as appealing as it is inaccurate. The Mayflower Compact is often hailed as a precursor to the Constitution, but remember, it was a stopgap measure, a practical fix for a legal predicament. It was more about maintaining order than declaring independence. Yet the narrative of the Pilgrims as proto-democrats stuck, helped along by 19th century writers who needed heroes to fit the nation-building narrative. Thanksgiving, too, got a makeover. The cozy image of pilgrims and Native Americans gathering around a table laden with turkey and pumpkin pie is a construct of later generations, an attempt to craft a unifying national story that glosses over the complexities and conflicts of early colonial history. The real first Thanksgiving was likely a modest harvest celebration, not the grand feast of legend. But the myth endures because it offers a simplistic narrative of unity and gratitude, even if the reality was far more complicated. As we wrap up this journey through history, let's not forget the human element. The Pilgrims were not just names in a textbook. They were people with dreams, fears, and an unyielding desire for a better life. Their voyage on the Mayflower was a leap into the unknown, a journey fraught with peril and promise. They faced adversity with a mix of faith, ingenuity, and an occasional stroke of luck. But their legacy is a complicated one, a tapestry of survival, economic struggle, and cultural conflict. It's a story that defies easy categorization, reminding us that the past is as messy and multifaceted as the present. As you drift off to sleep, let these tales of grit and resilience, of triumph and tragedy, remind you of the complex tapestry that is history. The legacy of the Mayflower voyage is not just a chapter in a book. It's a reminder of the enduring human spirit and the tangled roots of our shared past. Sweet dreams, and may your own journeys, however stormy, lead to new horizons. You're standing in a dusty field, your sandals sinking into the soil as you squint at the harsh Mediterranean sun. Welcome to the life of a Roman legionary recruit, where the glamour of conquering foreign lands is about as real as a toga made of mist. Forget those marble statues of muscular soldiers posed heroically. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of what it really took to wear that iconic Roman armor. First off, you don't just stroll into the Roman army like you're joining a club. No, sir. The recruitment process was as serious as a centurion's scowl. The Roman military machine was selective, and it had to be. The empire's borders stretched from Britain to Egypt, and they needed soldiers who could endure the grueling demands of keeping the peace or making war, depending on the emperor's mood. So, who made the cut? Well, you had to be a Roman citizen, which was a pretty exclusive club, and not just any citizen, but one in good standing. Crime bosses and debt-ridden gamblers need not apply. You also had to meet certain physical standards. We're talking about a height of at least 5 Roman feet and 10 Roman inches, which translates to roughly 5 feet 7 inches today. Not exactly NBA material, but you couldn't be a shrimp either. Once you passed the citizenship and height test, you faced the real deal, the Legionary's basic training. Imagine boot camp, but without the motivational posters or the occasional day off. Training was brutal, designed to mold you into a soldier who could march 20 miles a day with full gear. That's right, 20 miles. Your average day involved marching, weapon drills, and building fortifications. Toss in some wrestling and swimming for good measure, because why not? Remember, this was a time when the concept of work-life balance didn't exist. Your life was the army, and your pay reflected that commitment, or lack thereof. Legionaries earned about 225 denarii annually. To put it in context, a loaf of bread cost around 2 asses, and 1 denarius equaled about 16 asses. So, you'd need to save your coins if you wanted to splurge on a toga upgrade. Now, let's talk about the myth of the noble Roman soldier. The idea of the legionary as a disciplined, heroic figure was partly a product of Roman propaganda. Rome needed people to join the legions, and selling the dream was crucial. The reality, life was harsh. The food was basic, usually consisting of grain, vinegar, and the occasional bit of meat. The barracks were cramped, and your bed was likely a wooden board with a thin mattress. Forget about the creature comforts. Yet, the story of the Roman soldier is steeped in legend because that's what the Romans wanted. They were masters of propaganda, using triumphs and monuments to create an image that would entice young men to enlist. The promise of land and a pension after 25 years of service was dangled like a carrot on a stick. But let's be real, 25 years is a long time when life expectancy wasn't much higher than 40. So why would anyone choose this life? Well, for many, the army offered a chance to escape poverty and gain a semblance of security. The promise of land upon retirement was alluring, especially if you survived long enough to claim it. Plus, there was a sense of camaraderie and belonging that came with being part of something larger than yourself. But it was a hard life, make no mistake. The romanticized image of the noble legionary marching off to war with glory in his heart often glosses over the drudgery, the danger, and the sheer physical toll. This was a life of discipline and duty, with the occasional dash of disaster thrown in for good measure. In the end, the Roman legionary was part myth, part reality. The recruitment process was rigorous, the training relentless, and the pay meager. Yet, for those who survived the ordeal, there was a chance at a better life, or at least a life that was marginally better than the one they left behind. So, as you stand there in that dusty field, with a future of marching, drilling, and fighting ahead, remember, you're part of an empire, for better or worse. All right, so you're part of an empire, for better or worse. Let's fast forward to a day in the life of our Roman legionary, where your daily grind could make a Spartan boot camp look like a yoga retreat. Forget any visions of lounging in the shade of a Roman villa with grapes being peeled for you by adoring admirers. Your reality is a lot more brutal and a bit less laurel-wreathed. First up, let's talk about marching. You're expected to hoof at a solid 20 miles a day and not in your comfy Air Jordans. Nope, you're in Caliggy, those open-toed leather sandals that are about as kind to your feet as a bed of nails. And let's not forget your stylish accessory, about 90 pounds of gear. That's equivalent to lugging around a fully grown golden retriever, just without the wagging tail and puppy eyes. Your pack includes everything from your armor and weapons to basic supplies like food, a cooking pot, and a spade. Why a spade? Because when you're not marching or fighting, you're channeling your inner Barb the Builder, constructing roads or fortifications. Rome wasn't built in a day after all, but it was built by legionaries like you. Now, let's talk discipline. The Roman army ran a tight ship, tighter than a drum at a legionary parade. The hierarchy was as rigid as the marble columns of the Senate, with centurions at the top barking orders like drill sergeants on caffeine. Step out of line, and you'd better brace for the consequences. Punishments were doled out with a vigor that would make even the most tyrannical school principal seem soft. The worst of these was decimation, a practice that makes modern-day corporate layoffs look like a tea party. If a unit faltered or showed cowardice, 1 in every 10 men was chosen by lot to be clubbed to death by his comrades. It was a grim reminder that failure wasn't an option, unless you fancied becoming a cautionary tale. Now, about that romantic image of military life, the reality was a bit more like a B-grade horror movie. You might picture yourself as a fearless hero, charging into battle with glory in your heart and victory in your grasp. But the truth was more about blisters than banners. When you weren't on the move or fortifying some God-forsaken outpost, you were likely stuck in a cramped tent with a handful of other legionaries, trying to catch some shut-eye on a wooden board masquerading as a bed. Privacy was as rare as a Roman emperor without an ego, and personal space was a foreign concept. Meals were hardly a feast fit for Caesar. Your diet mostly consisted of grain, which you grind into a crude porridge that made gruel look like gourmet cuisine. Occasionally, you get a taste of garum, a fermented fish sauce that Romans loved and modern palates might politely decline. The good news, your sense of smell would eventually get used to it, or at least that's what you tell yourself while holding your nose. Despite the grind, the camaraderie was real. You and your fellow soldiers were bound by shared hardships, forging friendships that could withstand the toughest of campaigns. It was this unity that kept the Roman military machine humming despite the daily dose of drudgery. And there was always that glimmer of hope. Survive long enough, and you'd earn your land, your pension, and maybe even a chance to look back on these days with a sense of pride, or at least relief that they were over. So, as the sun sets on another grueling day, you find yourself contemplating the strange allure of this life. Sure, it's brutal, and the romantic veneer is thinner than a toga after a rainstorm, but there's something about being part of this vast, disciplined force that's undeniably appealing. It's a life of service, sacrifice, and occasionally satisfaction. And despite the hardships, you can't help but feel a certain kinship with the generations of legionaries who have marched these paths before you. Welcome to the Brotherhood, where the reality is as harsh as the legends are grand. And speaking of Brotherhood, let's not forget the real backbone of the Roman Empire, logistics. Yeah, it sounds about as exciting as a toga-washing contest, but trust me, the Roman military might as well have invented the phrase, "The devil is in the details." Without their logistical genius, Rome's legendary legions would be about as effective as a chariot with square wheels. Take the Roman roads, for example. Sure, you might think they're just fancy cobblestones for Caesar's chariots, but these roads were the arteries of an empire. Backbone, lifeline, and expressway all rolled into one. Stretching over 250,000 miles at their peak, these roads were meticulously constructed with layers of sand, gravel, and stone, ensuring durability that modern-day pothole-ridden streets can only dream of. They weren't just for show, either. These roads allowed legionaries to march at a pace of 20 miles a day, ensuring that Roman military power could swiftly reach any corner of the empire faster than you can say, "Veni, vidi, vici." But roads alone don't win wars. Enter the Roman supply lines, the unsung hero of every campaign. While the idea of living off the land sounds romantically rustic, the reality was a bit grimmer. An army marches on its stomach, and the Romans took this quite literally. Each legionary carried a few days' worth of provisions, but for longer campaigns, supply chains were crucial. Imagine a line of ox-drawn carts, stretching for miles, loaded with everything from grain to wine to weapons. The Romans even constructed granaries and depots along their routes, ensuring that their troops were as well fed as possible under the circumstances. Forget fast and furious. This was slow, and steady gets the job done. And then there's the nitty-gritty of military strategy. If you think ancient warfare was all about charging into battle with swords swinging, you've been watching too many Gladiator movies. Roman warfare was a calculated affair, more chess match than chaotic melee. Take the famed testudo formation, for instance. This wasn't just a human tank, but a symbol of Roman discipline and ingenuity. Legionaries would lock their shields together, creating an almost impenetrable barrier against arrows and spears. It's a tactic that highlighted the Romans' ability to adapt and survive, rather than relying on sheer brute force. You might say they knew how to shelter themselves from danger. Of course, all this strategy came at a cost. Long campaigns meant being separated from family, friends, and the comforts of home for years on end. Psychological and physical exhaustion were constant companions, with soldiers often battling the elements as much as they battled their enemies. The harsh realities of ancient warfare could break the hardest of men, turning even the most seasoned soldiers into weary shadows of their former selves. Disease ran rampant, with dysentery and malaria tagging along like uninvited guests at a toga party. And if you survived the battlefield, you still had to survive these microscopic foes. Yet, despite the hardships, victories were often achieved not through grand heroics, but through sheer endurance. The Romans understood that the true test of a soldier wasn't how many foes he could fell in a single battle, but whether he could withstand the grind of campaign after campaign. It was this dogged persistence that often turned the tide in Rome's favor, proving that sometimes the tortoise really does beat the hare. And let's not forget the political machinations behind the battles. Emperors and generals didn't wage wars just for fun or the thrill of conquest. Well, not always. Often, these campaigns were driven by politics and economics. A successful campaign could bolster an emperor's reputation, fill the empire's coffers with plunder, or secure vital resources like grain or metals. It's a harsh reminder that even the most legendary battles were often just cogs in the much larger machine of Roman politics. In the end, the logistics of Roman warfare reveal a complex tapestry of strategy, perseverance, and a touch of madness. It's a testament to how an empire built on the backs of its soldiers relied on more than just brute strength to maintain its dominance. The roads, the supply lines, the tactical innovations, each played a role in creating a military force that was as formidable as it was disciplined. And while the romantic image of the Roman legionary might be appealing, it's the gritty reality of their day-to-day struggles that truly shape the course of history. So, as you lace up your caligy and prepare for another day in the life of a Roman legionary, remember that you're not just part of a military machine. You're part of a logistical ballet where every step, every decision, and every mile marched is a brushstroke on the canvas of an empire. Keep marching, soldier. There's a legacy being forged under those sandals, one blister at a time. As you continue to march along those meticulously laid Roman roads, let's dive into the juicy underbelly of why you're really here. Spoiler alert, it's not for the scenic views or the endless supply of garum. The truth is, behind every epic battle and every grand procession through Rome, there's a tangled web of politics and economics that makes Game of Thrones look like a children's puppet show. First off, let's talk spoils of war. Because, let's be real, there's nothing like a little looting to justify the backbreaking life of a legionary. When Rome conquered new lands, it wasn't just about planting the imperial flag and moving on. Oh no, it was about ransacking cities, seizing treasures, and carting off anything that wasn't nailed down. Gold, silver, slaves, exotic spices, you name it, the Romans wanted it. This wasn't just pillaging for pleasure. It was economic necessity dressed up as military prowess. The wealth from these conquests wasn't just pocket change for the emperor's piggy bank. It was the lifeblood of Roman politics. The empire functioned on a complex system of patronage, where favors were traded like ancient baseball cards. Generals and politicians needed to spread the wealth around to keep their supporters happy and their enemies at bay. And nothing greased the wheels of Roman politics like a cartload of freshly looted gold. As for the legionaries, they weren't left empty-handed. Sure, your pay was as sparse as a Roman toga in a windstorm, but the promise of plunder was a powerful motivator. Each campaign offered the chance to pocket a little something extra, maybe a shiny goblet or a fine piece of armor pried from the hands of the fallen. It was a grim lottery, but when the usual prize was a few denarii, even a chance at a windfall was worth the gamble. But let's not kid ourselves. These military campaigns weren't just about lining pockets and collecting trophies. They were also about power, plain and simple. Rome was an empire built on expansion, and every new territory conquered was another feather in the cap of whichever power-hungry leader was sitting on the throne or commanding the legions. Territory meant resources, and resources meant power. Grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, and tin from Britain, all of these were vital to the empire's survival. The Romans didn't just conquer new lands, they assimilated them, turning them into cogs in the vast machinery of the empire. This brings us to the romanticized idea of glory and conquest, a narrative as polished as the marble in Caesar's palace. The reality, not so shiny. Conquering lands was more about keeping the empire afloat than about glorious deeds. It was a dog-eat-dog world, and Rome was determined to be the biggest, baddest dog on the block. Expansion wasn't just a hobby, it was a necessity. Without it, the empire would stagnate, and stagnation was the kiss of death. The political games behind these campaigns were as cutthroat as a gladiator match. Emperors and generals jockeyed for position, using military success to boost their status like ancient influencers chasing likes. A successful campaign could make or break a career, and failure was not an option unless you fancied an early retirement, Roman style, with a dagger in the back. Yet, despite the brutal reality, the allure of glory persisted. For every legionary trudging through mud and blood, there was the hope of returning home a hero, of one day seeing your name etched into the annals of Roman history. The reality might have been harsh, but the dream was intoxicating. So the next time you're hoisting your shield or sharpening your gladius, remember, you're not just a soldier. You're a pawn in a game that stretches far beyond the battlefield, into the heart of Roman politics and economics. Your sweat and blood help fuel an empire that's as much about pragmatism as it is about power. And while the myth of the noble legionary might be a comforting bedtime story, the truth is far more complex and infinitely more fascinating. As you march on, consider this. Every step you take is part of a larger dance, complex choreography that balances conquest with consolidation, glory with greed. And while the story of Rome is often told in sweeping epics and grandiose narratives, it's the gritty reality of life as a legionary that truly underscores the empire's might. So keep marching, because the story isn't over yet. There are still battles to fight, lands to conquer, and myths to unravel. Welcome to the heart of the Roman Empire, where the stakes are high, and the reality is anything but simple. Now, as you keep marching through the chronicles of Roman history, it's time to tackle the grand finale of the legionary saga, retirement. Ah, the golden years, or at least That's what the recruitment posters promised. After 25 years of service, the Roman Empire dangled the prospect of a peaceful retirement like a carrot on a very long stick. Land, citizenship, and a pension were the promised rewards for those who endured the grind. But as you might have guessed by now, reality had a knack for pulling the rug out. Let's start with the land grants. The idea was simple. Serve Rome, and Rome gives you a slice of earth to call your own. In theory, this was an appealing offer, especially for those who spent their youth in dirt-poor villages. But in practice, it was like winning a vacation to a location you never wanted to visit. Veterans often found their parcels of land were in the armpits of the empire, miles from civilization, and about as fertile as a rock quarry. The Romans weren't exactly handing out prime real estate in the heart of Tuscany. Instead, you'd find yourself on the fringes of the empire, in places like Gaul or Britannia, where the locals were about as welcoming as a Roman tax collector at a tavern. And then there was citizenship. For provincial soldiers, this was a big deal. Citizenship was the Roman version of a platinum card, offering legal rights and social status. It was the difference between being a spectator and a player in the grand game of Roman life. But the process was as tangled as a toga in a windstorm. Bureaucracy was alive and well in Rome, and getting your citizenship papers could take longer than an emperor's banquet. Plus, if you were from a non-Roman background, this citizenship was often more symbolic than practical. Sure, you got to vote, for all the good it did you when the emperor had the final say in everything. The pension, meanwhile, was a mixed bag. In the early days of the empire, retiring soldiers received a lump sum payment equivalent to about 12 years of salary. Not exactly a lottery win, but enough to start a new life if you managed your denarii wisely. However, as the empire's coffers thinned, so did these payouts. By the 3rd century, the treasury was so strapped that pensions were often paid in devalued coins, or not at all. It was like receiving a check written in disappearing ink. So what's an ex-legionary to do when the glory days are behind him, and the promised rewards feel more like a Roman comedy than a tragedy? Many return to their old lives, blending back into the rural countryside or the bustling city streets, often taking up farming or crafts. Others, disillusioned and itching for adventure, joined mercenary groups or local militias, where their military skills could still earn them a living. The dream of a peaceful retirement was just that, a dream. Instead of lounging in a villa with a goblet of wine, many found themselves working until their sandals wore thin. And yet, despite the less-than-glamorous end to their service, the legacy of the Roman legionary endures. These soldiers were the backbone of an empire whose shadow stretched across continents. They laid the roads, built the forts, and fought the battles that expanded and defended Rome's borders. It's a legacy that's both awe-inspiring and humbling, a testament to human endurance and the relentless march of history. But let's not sugarcoat it. The myth of the noble legionary is just that, a myth. The real story is one of blood, sweat, and often disillusionment. It's a reminder that behind every marble statue and every epic poem lies a gritty reality that's rarely as pretty. The Roman military machine was a marvel of organization and power, but it was also a grinder of men, chewing up countless lives in the name of empire. So as you look back over the dust and sweat of the legionary's journey, take a moment to ponder the human cost behind the might of Rome. The soldiers who trudged across deserts and mountains, who faced down barbarian hordes and political machinations, were as much victims of the empire's ambitions as they were its instruments. Their story is one of sacrifice and survival, of dreams deferred and promises unfulfilled. In the end, the Roman legionary was a hero not because of his battles or his conquests, but because he endured. He was a cog in a vast machine, and his story is a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. So here's to the legionaries, unsung heroes who marched across history with sandals on their feet and dreams in their hearts. They may not have found the paradise they were promised, but they left behind a legacy that still resonates through the ages. And with that, dear listener, our time in the sandals of a Roman legionary comes to a close. You've walked the dusty roads, faced the harsh realities, and seen beyond the marble facade. The Roman Empire may have crumbled, but the stories of its soldiers endure, a testament to an age where the myths were grand and the realities even grander. Keep these tales in mind as you roam through history, and remember, behind every legend is a legionary marching ever forward. If you were a medieval barber surgeon, you might have felt like the Swiss Army knife of your era, minus the nifty gadgets and all the glory. Your toolkit, a collection of sharp blades, a comb, maybe a leech or two. Your office, anywhere with a chair and decent lighting, if you were lucky. Forget the white coats and sterile environments of modern medicine. Your workspace would likely have the distinct aroma of unwashed bodies mixed with the tang of blood. Welcome to the gritty, unglamorous world of the medieval barber surgeon, where your day job was a bizarre cocktail of haircuts and amputations. Let's dive into why this peculiar combo of barbering and surgery even existed. Back in medieval Europe, becoming a doctor wasn't just a matter of wanting to heal people. It was an elite club open mostly to those with the coin to afford years of academic study. Universities charged hefty fees, and the textbooks were pricier than a night at a Renaissance fair. Most folks couldn't even read, let alone afford the luxury of university education. So, while the wealthy were off getting degrees and practicing medicine that was a mix of astrology and alchemy, the everyday person turned to their friendly neighborhood barber surgeon for help. You see, barber surgeons filled a crucial niche. They were the handymen of health, the everyman's emergency room in a world without public health care. If you needed a haircut, a shave, or a limb removed, you knew where to go. The barber pole you might associate with a shave today was originally a symbol of bloodletting, a practice where barbers would cut your skin to let out bad blood, a method believed to cure ailments. That red and white pole, it's said to represent the bloody bandages wrapped around a pole outside their shops. Charming, right? Economic necessity birthed this jack-of-all-trades profession. People needed services they could afford, and guess what? A barber's services were a fraction of a physician's fees. The barber surgeons were pragmatic, learning on the job rather than through formal schooling. If you were lucky, you'd apprentice under an experienced barber, picking up the skills of the trade over several years. No macat, no diplomas, just hands-on experience, and maybe a mentor with a steady hand. Barber surgeons were part of a guild, a sort of medieval union, offering some legitimacy to their work. The guilds regulated the profession, but let's not kid ourselves about quality control. A barber was only as good as his last successful procedure, and malpractice insurance was a concept for another millennium. The guilds did, however, standardize some procedures and tools, which was a step up from the free-for-all that was early medieval medicine. While the modern mind might recoil at the thought of a haircut and surgery sharing the same space, back then it made perfect economic sense. The dual role wasn't just a quirky medieval mashup. It was a practical response to a lack of accessible medical care. And let's face it, the notion of a barber also being your surgeon has a certain twisted appeal. It's like getting your oil changed and brakes fixed at the same garage, only with more mortality on the line. So, when you find yourself in a medieval village with a toothache, a fever, or simply in need of a trim, you'd likely head to the barber surgeon. He'd wield a razor with the same ease as a scalpel, offering solace in a world where even the common cold could be a death sentence. The barber surgeon was a figure of necessity and pragmatism, and while the romantic notion of a medieval healer might persist, the reality was often a bit more, shall we say, cutting. As you step into the daily grind of a medieval barber surgeon, brace yourself for a whirlwind of sights, sounds, and smells that could make your head spin faster than a town crier's proclamation. Today, if you walked into a medical office, you'd expect sterile equipment, sanitizing stations, and maybe a calming fish tank. But in the medieval world, you'd be lucky if the barber surgeon had rinsed his tools in a bucket of water that wasn't entirely murky. Hygiene was more of a suggestion than a rule, mostly because germ theory was still centuries away from its grand debut. Let's talk about the tools of the trade, shall we? Imagine a toolkit that looks more like a blacksmith's arsenal than a doctor's briefcase. The medieval barber surgeon's trusty companions included knives, razors, forceps, and bone saws. Yes, bone saws, because breaking a sweat was mandatory when severing limbs. These tools were often reused from patient to patient without so much as a wipe down, making cross-contamination as common as the plague. The barber's chair itself was the crucible of this chaotic operation, doubling as a venue for haircuts and bloodletting, with the same nonchalant attitude you might have for changing your oil and brakes at the same garage. Speaking of bloodletting, It was one of the most popular treatments of the day. People believed that ailments were caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, and letting out bad blood was the fast track to wellness. A barber surgeon would carefully, or not so carefully, nick a vein, allowing the blood to flow into a bowl. This procedure was so common that it became a hallmark of their practice. In fact, records indicate that in 1210, the University of Paris even banned physicians from performing surgery, leaving bloodletting and similar tasks to the barber surgeons. They were to physicians what a Swiss army knife is to a toolbox, versatile and essential, but not exactly precision instruments. Then there were the tooth extractions, a medieval solution for dental pain that involved yanking out the offending tooth with pliers. Anesthetic, that was a hearty swig of ale or a prayer. The procedure was quick, if you were lucky, and left you with a bloody grin and a painful recovery. Historical accounts reveal that people often turned to barber surgeons for dental work simply because they were cheaper and more accessible than a physician. It's safe to say that if Yelp existed back then, the reviews would be a mixed bag of fixed my toothache and left me with an infection. The outcomes of these procedures were as unpredictable as a medieval weather forecast. While some patients might walk away with a successful bloodletting session or a tooth-free smile, others faced grim consequences like infections, excessive bleeding, or worse. Yet, in the absence of alternatives, barber surgeons remained the go-to for the common folk. This wasn't just about a lack of options. It was about survival in a world where disease and injury were constant companions. Despite the grim realities, there's a certain dark humor in the barber surgeon's world. Imagine the barber surgeon, razor in one hand, saw in the other, as he seamlessly transitions from a shave to an amputation. It's a macabre juggling act that highlights the absurdity of medieval medicine. The idea that a haircut and a surgical procedure could be performed in the same appointment is the stuff of legends, and yet it's grounded in the economic necessity of the time. In this world of primitive tools and questionable hygiene, the barber surgeon was a figure of both fear and respect. They were the unsung heroes, operating on the razor's edge of life and death, with more grit than glamour. Their day-to-day life was a testament to the resilience of human ingenuity and the unending quest for healing, albeit with a hefty side of trial and error. So as you imagine the cacophony of a medieval barber surgeon's practice, the clanging of metal, the cries of patients, the constant buzz of chatter, remember that this was the front line of healthcare for the masses. The barber surgeon's world was a chaotic dance between necessity and innovation, with every procedure a gamble against the odds. As you walk away, you might find a newfound appreciation for the modern marvels of medicine and a chuckle at the bizarre history that paved the way. But let's not get too comfortable romanticizing the grit and grime of the medieval barber surgeon just yet. The reality was that these handymen of health found themselves tiptoeing through a minefield of religious, economic, and societal obstacles, like trying to juggle flaming torches while balancing on a tightrope, and the tightrope is on fire too. Enter the medieval church, an institution whose influence in Europe was as far-reaching as its doctrines were conservative. The church wasn't just a place for Sunday sermons. It was the moral and ethical compass for society, and it had some pretty strong opinions about surgery. In the 12th century, Pope Innocent Roman III decreed that clergy, who were the educated elite, couldn't spill blood, a rule that conveniently left barber surgeons to pick up the surgical slack. This religious ban wasn't just a spiritual dictum. It was a power move that kept the church's hands clean while offloading the dirty work to the less educated, less expensive barber surgeons. But why the squeamishness over surgery? Well, the church believed that the human body was sacred, and tampering with it, especially through something as brutal as surgery, was a no-go. Their stance was rooted in the belief that suffering was a divine test, a chance for spiritual growth. So, cutting into flesh, even for healing, was seen as meddling with divine will. It was a loophole-filled rule that pushed barber surgeons into the spotlight, albeit one with the harsh glare of suspicion. To add another layer to this medieval cake, let's talk guilds. These were the medieval version of trade unions, and for barber surgeons, their guild was both a lifeline and a leash. The guild regulated their trade, providing a semblance of legitimacy and protection in a society where the line between quack and qualified was blurrier than a foggy London morning. According to the 1540 Act of Parliament, barbers and surgeons in England were officially united under one guild, giving these practitioners a formal structure. But make no mistake, this wasn't exactly the Harvard of medical training. The guild set some standards, sure, but it was more about maintaining a monopoly on certain practices than ensuring high-quality healthcare. It was a bit like putting a band-aid on a broken arm. The guild helped, but it wasn't solving the deeper issues. Now, a historical text from the era, like the Chirurgia Magna by Guy de Chauliac, illustrates the barber-surgeon's plight. De Chauliac, who was both a physician and a surgeon, wrote extensively about the challenges faced by his contemporaries. He noted, for the most part, surgeons are unlearned and their work's uncertain. Translation. Even in his time, there was skepticism about the skill level of those wielding the razors and saws. Barber surgeons were caught in a catch-22. They were essential yet expendable, respected yet ridiculed. Economically, barber surgeons were a godsend for the common folk. While wealthy patrons could afford the luxury of a physician's care, the average medieval Joe had to make do with what he could afford. A physician's fee could be a fortune, whereas a barber surgeon offered a budget-friendly alternative. It's like choosing between a Michelin-starred restaurant and a food truck. Both fill you up, but only one doesn't require a second mortgage. Yet the barber surgeon's role wasn't entirely born of economic necessity. It was a pragmatic solution to a healthcare system that was, frankly, non-existent for most people. When universities like Salerno and Bologna were teaching medicine as an academic pursuit, the practical side of surgery was left to those who learned by doing, not by reading. Barber surgeons became the unsung heroes of hands-on medical practice, even if their methods were more trial and error than tried and true. Despite these hurdles, or perhaps because of them, the barber surgeon's world was a dance with danger, a high-wire act without a net. They balanced the demands of faith and science, survival and skepticism, all while navigating a societal landscape as unpredictable as a medieval weather forecast. They operated in a world where your barber could be your surgeon, your dentist, and your confidant, a jack of all trades in a time when specialization was a luxury. In the end, the barber surgeons were the realists in a world of idealists, providing care when and where it was needed, even as they grappled with the weight of societal expectations and the harsh realities of their practice. Their legacy is a testament to human adaptability and the relentless pursuit of healing, even when the odds are stacked against you. So, the next time you pass by a barber pole, spare a thought for these medieval multitaskers. They were the bridge between superstition and science, navigating a world that was as much about faith as it was about flesh and bone. But let's not linger too long on the image of the barber surgeon as a nostalgic figure of yore. Their reality was less about romantic heroics and more about surviving a medieval healthcare system that was a hot mess of superstition, necessity, and the occasional accidental breakthrough. You see, the allure of the barber surgeon as a multitasking marvel of medieval medicine glosses over the gritty truths they faced daily. They weren't exactly gallivanting through the cobblestone streets like some kind of health crusader. They were more like the beleaguered handyman patching up society's ailments with whatever tools they could muster. Consider the Black Death, the 14th century pandemic with a body count so high it makes modern outbreaks look like a sneeze in comparison. This bubonic plague swept across Europe from 1347 to 1351, wiping out an estimated 25 million people, about a third of the continent's population. It's hard to overstate the impact this had on the barber surgeon's world. While doctors, who were often university-trained and focused on the theoretical aspects of medicine, scrambled to make sense of the chaos, barber surgeons were thrust into the front line of an existential crisis. Their work was less about theory and more about immediate, albeit rudimentary, action. The plague was an equal opportunity killer, and the barber surgeon's shop became a triage center for the masses, where the line between life and death was a matter of guesswork and guts. In the face of such overwhelming mortality, the romantic idea of the barber surgeon as a hero becomes painfully inadequate. They weren't equipped to handle a pandemic of this magnitude. Heck, nobody was. Their education was hands-on, not head in the books. They learned by doing, adapting, and sometimes failing spectacularly. The myth of the jack-of-all-trades hero dissolves when you realize they were more like the last line of defense, using whatever knowledge and superstition they had to offer some semblance of care. In the absence of effective treatment, many turned to barber surgeons out of sheer desperation. After all, when the grim reaper's at your door, you'll try anything. Now, the Black Death didn't just decimate the population. It also catalyzed a shift in medical roles across Europe. The sheer scale of the devastation forced society to reevaluate its approach to healthcare. As the dust settled, the medical landscape began to evolve, albeit slowly. A demand for more specialized knowledge emerged, driven by the realization that barber surgeons' one-size-fits-all approach wasn't enough to combat complex diseases. This was the turning point where the seeds of medical specialization were sown, leading to a gradual phasing out of the barber surgeon's role as the primary provider of surgical and medical care. Advancements in science and technology were like a slow-burning fuse, leading to an explosive transformation in healthcare. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe saw the rise of more specialized medical practitioners, surgeons who focused solely on surgery and physicians who delved into the emerging field of anatomy and physiology. The barber's role was increasingly relegated to grooming as the medical community began to separate the practice of surgery from haircuts and shaves. It was a necessary evolution, but let's not forget, it took some time before this professional disentangling became widespread. The barber surgeon's legacy lingered, a testament to their pivotal role during a transitional period in medical history. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century by Johannes Gutenberg was a game-changer too. Suddenly, medical texts and surgical manuals could be mass-produced, spreading knowledge far and wide. Surgeons could learn from the best without having to travel to distant universities. Take Ambroise Paré, a French barber surgeon-turned-surgeon whose work in the 16th century laid the groundwork for modern surgical techniques. Paré's use of ligatures to stop bleeding during amputations was a vast improvement over the traditional method of cauterization with a red-hot iron. His writings reached a wider audience thanks to the printing press, elevating the practice of surgery beyond the barber's chair and into the realm of science. However, let's not get too carried away with progress just yet. The transition from barber surgeons to specialized medical professionals wasn't a smooth ride. It was more like a bumpy medieval cart journey, unpredictable, uncomfortable, and occasionally veering off the beaten path. While advancements in medical science and technology were underway, they didn't magically erase the barber surgeon's presence. Economic factors, societal resistance, and sheer inertia meant these changes unfolded over decades, not overnight. For instance, in England, it wasn't until the mid-18th century that the company of surgeons broke away from the barbers, forming what would eventually become the Royal College of Surgeons. This formal separation marked the final nail in the barber surgeon's coffin, at least in terms of their surgical practice. Yet, in rural areas, or among lower socioeconomic classes, barber surgeons continued to ply their trade, filling the gaps left by a healthcare system still in its infancy. As we look back at the barber surgeon's journey from multitasking necessity to historical relic, it's essential to recognize both the myth and the reality. On one hand, they were indeed the everyman's answer to healthcare in a world that had few alternatives. On the other hand, their role was a stopgap measure, born out of necessity rather than a grand vision of medical mastery. They were, in many ways, the unsung placeholders in a narrative that was slowly inching toward modernity. The romanticized myth of the barber surgeon as a heroic figure is undeniably appealing. After all, who doesn't love a good underdog story? But the reality was far less glamorous. They were craftspeople, often working in less than ideal conditions, facing societal and religious constraints, and battling diseases they barely understood. Their story is one of resilience, adaptability, and the harsh truth that necessity is indeed the mother of invention. So, the next time you see a barber pole spinning in the wind, remember the barber surgeons who stood at the crossroads of superstition and science. They were the bridge between the mystical and the medical, wielding their razors and saws with a determination that defied the odds. Their legacy is a reminder that progress often comes from the most unlikely of places, and that history is as much about the gritty details as it is about the grand narratives. As we end this chapter, let's leave the stage set for the next act. How these early efforts paved the way for the specialized, sanitized, and scientifically driven medical world we know today. As we dive into the final act of the Barber surgeon saga, let's assess their legacy and peer into how their struggles still resonate in today's healthcare landscape. You see, the Barber surgeons, with their razors and saws, were the unlikely pioneers of hands-on medicine. They were the duct tape fixing medieval healthcare's gaping holes, effective in a pinch, but hardly a permanent solution. Their legacy is a mixed bag of grit and grimace. On one hand, they democratized access to medical care at a time when seeing a physician was about as likely as winning the medieval lottery. Their hands-on approach laid the groundwork for future medical practices. Ambroise Paré, for instance, a barber surgeon turned official surgeon to the kings of France, was instrumental in moving surgery away from the bloody mess of cauterization towards more humane methods like ligatures to tie off arteries during amputations. Paré's work, catalyzed by the printing press, spread like wildfire among European practitioners, marking a significant step forward in surgical techniques. Yet, let's not get too carried away hailing them as the knights of medical innovation. Despite their contributions, barber surgeons were often stumbling through the dark, armed with nothing more than gut instinct and rudimentary skills. Their training was less about medical enlightenment and more about trial and error, with the latter sometimes leading to rather permanent errors. Their very existence was a band-aid solution to a medieval healthcare system that was as non-existent as a good Wi-Fi signal in the middle of a forest. Fast forward to today, and you'll see that the ghosts of the barber surgeons still haunt the corridors of modern medicine. Access and affordability remain hot-button topics. In medieval times, if you couldn't afford a physician, you went to the barber surgeon. Today, the healthcare debate often revolves around similar themes. Who can afford what level of care, and how accessible it is to the masses? The barber surgeons were the precursors to today's urgent care clinics, offering immediate, albeit basic, treatment to those who couldn't wait or pay for a specialist. Economic necessity forced barber surgeons to juggle roles, much like today's general practitioners who find themselves doing everything from diagnosing common colds to managing chronic diseases. The same economic pressures that birthed the barber surgeon still drive the healthcare conversation. In the U.S., for instance, healthcare spending was a whopping $3.8 trillion in 2019, with costs rising faster than the medieval church could ban bloodletting. It's a modern-day echo of an age-old problem, how to provide effective care without breaking the bank. And let's talk about the allure of multitasking. The barber surgeon was the original jack-of-all-trades, a concept that still holds romantic appeal. Who wouldn't want a one-stop shop for their medical needs? Yet, the harsh reality is that specialization, while initially slow to develop, was necessary for progress. We now have specialists for every conceivable medical issue, from cardiologists to podiatrists, each focusing on their own tiny corner of the vast medical universe. This fragmentation of roles is a testament to the complexity and advancement of modern medicine, a far cry from the days of one man doing it all with a rusty razor. Despite the evolution, the barber surgeon's spirit persists. The drive to innovate in the face of adversity, to adapt and learn on the fly, is as relevant now as it was in the bustling medieval marketplace. Their story is a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and health is a messy, relentless journey, often punctuated by more failures than triumphs. As we grapple with global health crises and the challenge of providing equitable health care, the barber surgeon's tale is a poignant reminder of our shared struggle. So, what's the final takeaway from this historical rabbit hole? Well, perhaps it's this. The human quest for health and understanding is an eternal tightrope walk, teetering between the known and the unknown, the romantic and the real. Barber surgeons may have been armed with little more than guts and gumption, but they were the stepping stones to the sophisticated healthcare systems we rely on today. They're a testament to human resilience and ingenuity, even when the odds were stacked higher than a medieval monastery's walls. As you close this chapter and step back into the modern world, spare a thought for the medieval multitaskers who, despite the odds, laid the groundwork for future generations. Their story isn't just about haircuts and hacksaws. It's about the indomitable human spirit and the relentless drive to heal, learn, and progress. And who knows, the next time you walk past a barber pole, you might just smile at the thought of those bygone days when a haircut might come with a side of surgery, no appointment necessary. When it comes to historical transformations, few tales are as compelling as that of the Khmer Empire's meteoric rise in Southeast Asia. Picture a small kingdom in what's now Cambodia, quietly minding its own business in the early 9th century, only to burst onto the scene as a regional juggernaut. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just luck, and there were no magical interventions, unless you count the charisma and political shenanigans of a certain Jayavarman Roman II. Now, Jayavarman Roman II was no ordinary leader. He wasn't just content with ruling a few acres of jungle. He had the ambition to unite the disparate Khmer territories and create something that would make his ancestors proud, like a medieval version of assembling a jigsaw puzzle with pieces scattered across Southeast Asia. In 800 2C, he declared himself the universal monarch, a bold move that was part political genius, part ego trip. This declaration, made on Mount Cullen, wasn't just for show. It signified a break from Javanese control, which is a fancy way of saying, we're doing our own thing now, thanks. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. The real genius of Jayavarman Roman II lay in his understanding of medieval power dynamics. He didn't just waltz into power, he networked. He formed alliances, brokered peace treaties, and occasionally had to unsheathe the sword. Think of it as Game of Thrones, minus the dragons, but with a lot more humidity. He unified various Khmer-speaking communities under his banner, a feat as impressive as getting everyone in the office to agree on which pizza topping to order for lunch. One of Jayavarman Roman II's key strategies was to align himself with the Devaraja cult, essentially branding himself as a guard king. This wasn't just a clever PR move. It was a way to legitimize his rule and ensure a divine mandate that would make any potential usurper think twice before challenging him. After all, who wants to mess with someone who's got the guards on speed dial? While Jayavarman Roman II was busy consolidating power, let's not forget the backdrop against which he was operating. The early medieval period in Southeast Asia was a bit like a political minefield. You had the Srivijaya Empire flexing its naval muscles to the west, and the Champa Kingdom causing a ruckus to the east. It was a tough neighborhood, and survival depended on a mix of diplomacy, military prowess, and occasionally sheer audacity. The Khmer Empire's expansion under Jayavarman Roman II didn't just rely on sweet-talking and divine proclamations. Warfare was an integral part of the expansion strategy, and the Khmer army was nothing if not formidable, with elephants as their tanks and an infantry that didn't know the meaning of retreat. They managed to extend their influence across a region that would eventually include parts of modern-day Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Think of it as the original Southeast Asian expansion pack, complete with all the bells and whistles of territorial acquisition. But here's the kicker. While Jayavarman Roman II was busy building his empire, he was also laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the jewel in the Khmer crown, Angkor. We'll get to that architectural marvel soon enough, but for now, let's focus on how this empire, while impressive, was also a study in contrasts. On one hand, you had a deeply spiritual society with intricate beliefs and rituals. On the other, there was the harsh reality of maintaining power in a region where allegiances could shift quicker than a sand dune in a storm. If you're sensing a theme here, it's that the Khmer Empire's rise was as much about savvy leadership as it was about brute force. Jayavarman Roman II wasn't just a king. He was a strategist, a statesman, and occasionally a bit of a showman. He knew that to maintain control, he needed more than just soldiers. He needed buy-in from the local elites and the peasantry, which he achieved through a mix of religious and administrative reforms. Yet, despite all the grand declarations and military campaigns, the life of a Khmer ruler wasn't all sunshine and lotus flowers. Running an empire the size of Khmer meant dealing with logistics that could give modern CEOs a run for their money. Roads had to be built, irrigation canals dug, and cities constructed, an ancient infrastructure project that would make even the most hardened civil engineer break into a sweat. As Jayavarman Roman II reign continued, he demonstrated a knack for balancing conquest with consolidation. Once he'd conquered a territory, he didn't just leave it to its own devices. He integrated it into the Khmer Empire's administrative framework, ensuring a steady flow of tribute. And let's be honest, taxes. After all, empire building isn't cheap, and those stone temples don't build themselves. In the end, the rise of the Khmer Empire under Jayavarman II is a testament to the power of vision and the art of leadership. It's a story of transformation from a collection of small, warring states into a cohesive empire, a feat that requires not just ambition, but the ability to make that ambition a reality. As with all great leaders, Jayavarman II's true genius lay in his ability to adapt and innovate, turning a diverse and often fractious region into a powerhouse that would leave an indelible mark on history. And so, as the 9th century drew to a close, the Khmer Empire was poised for greatness, led by a king who had not only carved out a place for himself in the annals of history, but had also set the stage for the monumental achievements of his successors. It's a tale of audacity, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of power set against the lush backdrop of Southeast Asia, a story that, much like the empire itself, continues to captivate and inspire. As the 9th century set the stage for greatness, the Khmer Empire was ready for its next act, and what an act it was. Enter King Suryavarman II, a ruler whose name would become synonymous with one of history's most audacious architectural undertakings, Angkor Wat. Now, if you've ever tried to assemble IKEA furniture without instructions, you'll appreciate the enormity of building a temple complex like Angkor Wat without cranes, bulldozers, or even a decent YouTube tutorial on ancient construction techniques. Suryavarman II, an ambitious monarch reigning from 1113 to about 1150 CE, wasn't content with just ruling. He wanted to leave a legacy that would echo through the ages. And what's a better way to make your mark than by commissioning the world's largest religious monument? That's right, folks. Angkor Wat wasn't just a pretty face. It was the Khmer Empire's resume, LinkedIn profile, and Oscar acceptance speech all rolled into one. Let's start with the logistics, shall we? First, the manpower. Think of the construction crew not as a small army, but an actual army, literally. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of workers were involved, including skilled artisans, laborers, and architects. And unlike your average office team-building exercise, this wasn't optional. Many of these workers were conscripted, with the temple's construction serving as both a religious duty and a royal command. The materials? Oh, just a casual 5 million to 10 million sandstone blocks, each weighing up to 5 tons. These blocks were quarried from the Kulin Mountains, about 50 kilometers away. Imagine hauling those without the help of a U-Haul. Instead, the Khmer relied on an intricate network of canals and waterways, effectively turning parts of the landscape into a conveyor belt of stone. The engineering prowess was impressive, but it also came with a side of sweat, laboring under a tropical sun that could melt even the stoniest of resolves. Now, let's bust a few myths. For starters, Angkor Wat wasn't built by divine intervention or aliens, no matter how tempting that theory might be. Instead, it was the product of human ingenuity, determination, and yes, a fair amount of coercion. The temple served as both a spiritual center dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu and a political statement of Suryavarman II's divine right to rule. It was like a cosmic linked-in endorsement from Vishnu himself, but with more incense and less spam. But what about the labor force that turned Suryavarman's grand vision into reality? These weren't just faceless drones. They were real people with lives, families, and, let's face it, probably a few complaints about working conditions. The construction of Angkor Wat relied heavily on the labor of the peasantry, who were drafted into service as part of their feudal obligations. In a society where the king was seen as a god-king, saying no wasn't exactly an option. The economic context of this endeavor is just as fascinating. Building Angkor Wat wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a financial one. The Khmer Empire's wealth was largely agricultural, with rice serving as its economic backbone. The surplus generated by this agrarian society funded the construction, with the temple complex itself acting as a kind of ancient investment portfolio. The rewards were clear. A majestic symbol of Khmer civilization that attracted pilgrims, traders, and eventually the admiration of the world. Yet, for all its grandeur, Angkor Wat wasn't just about the aesthetics. It was a microcosm of the Khmer Empire's worldview, a blend of Hindu mythology and Khmer cosmology, carved into stone with a precision that would make any modern architect swoon. The central tower symbolized Mount Meru, the axis of the universe in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, surrounded by smaller towers representing the mountain ranges. It was a three-dimensional representation of the spiritual realm, a cosmic diagram you could actually walk through. The construction of Angkor Wat also reflects the political and social dynamics of the time. Suryavarman II wasn't just building a temple, he was solidifying his rule, fostering a sense of Khmer identity, and establishing his legacy. The temple served as a unifying symbol, bringing together the disparate elements of the empire under a single, awe-inspiring vision. But let's not romanticize it too much. The reality of building such a structure was harsh. The workers faced grueling conditions, and while the end result was a masterpiece, the journey to get there was anything but idyllic. It was a tale of human endurance, ingenuity, and let's be honest, a fair amount of royal arm-twisting. As the sun set on Suryavarman II's reign, Angkor Wat stood as a testament to his ambition, a sprawling complex that captured the imagination of future generations. It's a story of vision and perseverance, a reminder that even the most monumental achievements are built on the backs of countless individuals whose names have long been forgotten by history. And while the myth of divine intervention adds a touch of mystery, the true story is one of human effort and the unyielding desire to create something that would stand the test of time. So, next time you find yourself marveling at Angkor Wat, remember the thousands of hands that shaped its stones, the minds that conceived its design, and the king who dared to dream it into existence. It's a legacy carved in stone, a testament to the power of human imagination and the relentless pursuit of greatness. And as we continue to peel back the layers of history, let's not forget the stories of those who made such marvels possible. One block, one dream, one relentless ambition at a time. And speaking of blocks, let's delve into the architectural wonderland of Angkor Wat. This isn't just any temple. It's like the ancient world's answer to a luxury skyscraper, only horizontal and with a lot more stone. As you stroll past its towering spires and sprawling galleries, walking through a living testament to Khmer genius. Imagine if the architects of the time had access to today's technology. Angkor Wat might have been a multi-story wonder with elevators and a cappuccino bar. First, let's talk bas-reliefs. These intricate carvings are the ancient world's equivalent of a Netflix binge watch. Spanning over 800 meters, these stone tapestries narrate epic tales from Hindu mythology, including the famous churning of the ocean of milk. That's right, folks, before ice cream sundaes, there was cosmic milk churning. The bas-reliefs depict an epic tug-of-war between gods and demons, using a giant serpent as their rope. It's like the ultimate workplace team-building exercise with a divine twist. These carvings aren't just for show. They're a masterclass in storytelling, politics, and religion rolled into one. Each panel reflects the Khmer Empire's spiritual beliefs and serves as a political statement of divine right, reinforcing Suryavarman II's claim to power. The precision and detail in these carvings would make even Michelangelo break a sweat. The artists achieved staggering levels of detail, capturing everything from the ripples of muscles to the folds of fabric. In a world without CGI, this was as immersive as it got. But what's a temple without a solid foundation, right? Enter the hydraulic engineering marvels of Angkor Wat. The Khmer took water management to a whole new level, creating an intricate network of moats, canals, and reservoirs. These weren't just decorative. They were vital for irrigation, flood control, and of course, showing off. The temple is surrounded by a massive moat, 200 meters wide and over 5 kilometers long, which not only protected the structure, but also symbolized the oceans surrounding Mount Meru. It's like building a model universe using water features, something even the most ambitious garden designer would envy. Now, let's tackle the big question. Was Angkor Wat's design a masterstroke of ancient feng shui, or just someone flexing their Pinterest prowess? While there's no denying the aesthetic appeal, the layout was deeply symbolic. The temple's orientation towards the west, a direction usually associated with death in Hindu tradition, has sparked debates among scholars. Some suggest this was a deliberate choice by Suryavarman II to align himself with Vishnu, the preserver of the universe, while others see it as a nod to funerary purposes, possibly hinting at the king's own grandiose send-off plans. And what about the temple's towering spires? These weren't just designed to scrape the sky. They were symbolic representations of Mount Meru's peaks. The central tower, standing at around 65 meters, is flanked by 4 smaller towers, creating a cosmic skyline that mirrored the universe itself. It's a celestial map carved in stone, a testament to the Khmer's architectural prowess and their deep connection to the divine. Economically speaking, building Angkor Wat was like launching a nation-sized Kickstarter campaign, only with rice and labor as the main currencies. The empire's agrarian success funded the monumental project, with rice paddies serving as the financial engine. The surplus not only fed the workers, but also supported the kingdom's trade networks, creating a cycle of prosperity that fueled further expansions. Politics, of course, played a role too. The temple wasn't just a religious site, it was a power statement. By constructing such a grand monument, Suryavarman II was sending a clear message to his rivals. I'm here, I'm favored by the gods, and I have the stones to prove it. It was a way to unify the empire under one grand vision, blending spirituality with statecraft in a way that would make any modern politician envious. And let's not forget the sheer manpower involved. Tens of thousands of workers toiled day and night, their lives devoted to turning this grand vision into reality. These weren't just faceless laborers. They were artisans, engineers, and craftsmen whose skills were honed over generations. While the king enjoyed the glory, these were the true heroes of Angkor Wat, their sweat and skill etched into every block. Despite the grandeur, building Angkor Wat wasn't all lotus flowers and incense. The logistics were mind-boggling. Transporting those sandstone blocks from the Kulin Mountains required not just manpower, but ingenious engineering. The Khmer devised a system of canals and roads that turned the landscape into a conveyor belt, a feat of planning that would make modern supply chain managers nod in admiration. The temple's construction also reflects the socio-political landscape of the time. Suryavarman II wasn't just a builder, he was a strategist, using the temple as a tool to consolidate power and foster unity. The temple served as a pilgrimage site, drawing people from across the empire and beyond, reinforcing the Khmer's cultural and religious influence. In the end, Angkor Wat is more than just a temple. It's a testament to human ambition, creativity, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. It's a story etched in stone, a legacy that continues to captivate and inspire. As we wander through its ancient corridors, let's remember the countless hands that shaped its stones, the minds that conceived its design, and the king who dared to dream it into existence. It's a legacy carved in stone, a testament to the power of human imagination and the relentless pursuit of greatness. So, as we unravel the mysteries of Angkor Wat, let's keep our eyes open for the stories etched in its stones, the tales of gods and kings, of ambition and achievement. And with each step, let's honor the legacy of those who made it possible, one block, one dream, one relentless ambition at a time. And speaking of relentless ambition, let's dive into the socio-economic whirlpool that was the Khmer Empire at its peak. You see, while Angkor Wat was the glittering crown jewel, the empire boasted a complex web of trade networks, religious fervor, and let's face it, a social hierarchy that made the pyramids look like a flat pancake. First off, let's talk trade. The Khmer Empire wasn't just sitting pretty on its rice paddies. It was actively engaging in trade with its neighbors. Think spices, textiles, precious metals, and ceramics flowing in and out like an ancient stock market on steroids. The empire's strategic location in Southeast Asia was like having a prime spot at a medieval trade show, with routes connecting India, China, and the rest of the Southeast Asian archipelago. Ships were the Ubers of the day, albeit a bit slower and more prone to piracy. Economically, this trade was the lifeblood of the empire. It wasn't just about accumulating shiny objects. It was about maintaining power and influence. The Khmer elite knew that to keep their empire running, they needed more than just rice and religious rites. By trading with neighboring entities like the Srivijaya Empire and the Song dynasty, they not only enriched their coffers, but also secured valuable alliances. It's like the ancient version of networking, but with more spices and fewer linked-in requests. Now, let's not gloss over the role of religion in this bustling empire. The Khmer Empire was a theocracy on steroids, with kings like Suryavarman II positioning themselves as god kings, a title that would make any modern politician drool with envy. Religion was intertwined with governance, and Angkor Wat served as the cosmic centerpiece. The temple wasn't just a place to worship. It was a manifestation of the divine order, a constant reminder of the king's celestial endorsement. The empire's spiritual life revolved around a mix of Hinduism and Buddhism, with the gods and Buddha having more overlap than a Venn diagram on caffeine. The temple complexes, Angkor Wat included, were more than just religious hubs. They were economic powerhouses. Pilgrims and traders flocked to these sites, bringing their offerings and their wallets. In return, the temple economy provided jobs, from priests to artisans to the guy who cleaned the moat. The whole setup was like an ancient precursor to tourist economies today, but with more incense and less air conditioning. But let's pivot to the daily grind for the average Khmer citizen. While the elite were busy playing God, the common folk were toiling away to keep the empire's gears turning. Picture a society where your birth determined your role, much like an RPG, but with fewer dragons and more rice paddies. The vast majority of people were peasants, working the fields and maintaining the intricate irrigation systems that made the Khmer agricultural engine purr. These irrigation networks were engineering marvels, with barrages, reservoirs, and canals ensuring a steady water supply. It was a system that could make even modern irrigation engineers nod in approval. Of course, while the peasants were busy with their back-breaking work, they were also paying taxes. Lots of them. Because what's an empire without a good tax system, right? The Khmer used a form of corvée labor, which meant that peasants were required to work on state projects, like building temples or roads, as a form of taxation. It was a bit like jury duty, only with more physical labor and fewer objections. And then there's the delightful social stratification. The Khmer Empire was a society where your status was as rigid as the stone blocks of Angkor Wat. At the top were the kings, followed by nobles and priests, all enjoying the fruits of others' labor. Below them, artisans and traders formed the middle tier, providing goods and services. At the bottom, surprise, surprise, were the peasants, the backbone of the empire whose contributions often went unnoticed. It's a tale as old as time, the few reaping the benefits while the many do the heavy lifting. But let's sprinkle in some gallows humor, shall we? Imagine being a peasant, waking up every day knowing your life's work was essentially to keep the elite lounging in their palaces, while you got to enjoy the occasional festival as your only respite. The social system was as unyielding as the tropical heat, and while the kings might have had divine status, the average Joe was more concerned with divine weather forecasts, like, will it rain enough to keep the crops alive? Despite this rigid hierarchy, the Khmer Empire was a marvel of human achievement. Its ability to maintain such a vast and intricate system of governance, trade, and religion is nothing short of impressive, even if it came at the cost of countless lives spent in toil. The empire's reach extended through diplomacy and warfare, with the Khmer army being a formidable force. Elephants were the tanks of the day, and the soldiers, well, they had the kind of determination you only find in those who have been conscripted into service. The empire's peak was a time of prosperity, but it was also a time of tension. The balance between power and the populace was delicate, and the empire's reliance on agricultural surplus and trade meant that any disruption, be it natural disaster or political upheaval, could send ripples throughout the land. You can almost imagine the king's advisors sweating over maps and scrolls, trying to keep the empire from crumbling under its own weight. In the end, the socio-economic fabric of the Khmer Empire was a tapestry woven with ambition, spirituality, and the labor of its people. It's a story of grandeur built on the backs of the many, a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of legacy. While the kings may have been the stars of the show, the true heartbeat of the empire lay with those who tilled the fields, crafted the goods, and worshipped at the temples. It's a saga of power and perseverance, where every stone laid at Angkor Wat tells a story of aspiration and endurance. So as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the Khmer Empire, let's tip our hats to the unsung heroes who shaped its destiny. The traders, the farmers, the artisans, the real movers and shakers of history, even if their names didn't make it into the annals. And as we ponder the empire's legacy, let's remember that behind every grand structure and every mighty king, there's a story of human resilience and the unyielding quest for greatness. Stay tuned, because the tale of the Khmer Empire is far from over, and there's plenty more history to uncover. As we pivot to the twilight of the Khmer Empire, it's a tale of grandeur giving way to decline, like a rock star realizing the backstage party can't last forever. The empire that once stretched its influence across Southeast Asia began to falter, leaving behind monumental ruins as reminders of its former glory. The decline of the Khmer Empire and the eventual abandonment of Angkor Wat is a story rich with intrigue, mystery, and lessons that resonate eerily with today's world. First up, let's talk about climate change. Yes, even medieval empires weren't exempt from Mother Nature's mood swings. Evidence from tree rings and sediment cores suggests a series of devastating droughts hit the region in the 14th and 15th centuries. The once mighty irrigation systems that sustained the empire's agricultural might began to crumble under the pressure, much like a millennial facing their student loans. These droughts weren't just inconvenient, they were catastrophic. Picture a society built on rice which now refused to grow as water sources dried up. The Khmer Empire's sophisticated water management systems were the stuff of engineering legend. But as the climate changed, these systems became less reliable. The reservoirs and canals that once acted as the empire's lifeblood turned into liabilities. With water scarcity came food shortages, and with food shortages came social unrest. It's a classic case of too many mouths and not enough rice bowls, leading to a breakdown in the social contract that held the empire together. But it wasn't just the weather that spelled doom for the Khmer. Political instability played its hand, too. The empire was no stranger to internal power struggles, but as the 14th century rolled in, these became more pronounced. A succession of weak rulers failed to maintain the strong, centralized control that had been the empire's hallmark. Imagine a game of political musical chairs, where everyone's too busy fighting over the throne to notice the orchestra's packed up and left. External pressures compounded these internal woes. The rise of neighboring powers like the Ayutthaya kingdom in what is now Thailand posed significant threats. These new kids on the block weren't just flexing their muscles, they were actively encroaching on Khmer territory. Wars were costly, both in terms of resources and manpower, and the Khmer Empire found itself stretched thin, like butter over too much bread. Thanks, Tolkien, for that analogy. As the empire's power waned, so did its ability to maintain Angkor Wat. The temple complex, once a vibrant center of religious and political life, began to see its luster fade. The infrastructure deteriorated, and the workforce that once toiled to maintain its grandeur was redirected to more pressing concerns, like keeping the empire from completely falling apart. By the time the 15th century rolled around, Angkor Wat was abandoned, a ghostly reminder of the empire's faded glory. But let's not solely blame the elements and external enemies. The Khmer rulers themselves weren't exactly blameless. Their focus on monumental architecture over sustainable governance meant that while the stone structures stood the test of time, their political institutions did not. It's a tale as old as time. Prioritizing appearances over substance rarely ends well. Yet, despite the decline, Angkor Wat remains a marvel, enduring through centuries as a testament to human ambition and achievement. It's the ultimate symbol of the Khmer Empire's reach and its tragic inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Today, it stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, drawing millions of visitors who marvel at its beauty and wonder about the civilization that built it. As we wander through its ancient corridors, it's hard not to reflect on the parallels with today's world. Climate change, political instability, and resource scarcity are challenges we continue to face. The Khmer Empire's story offers both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. It's a reminder that human ingenuity can create wonders, but also that neglect and hubris can lead to downfall. In the end, Angkor Wat is more than just a relic of the past. It's a living lesson. It teaches us about the heights of human creativity and the depths of our folly. It's a story of ambition and arrogance, of a civilization that reached for the stars, but forgot to check the weather forecast. As we gaze upon its towering spires, let's remember the empire that dared to dream big and the inevitable reality that even the mightiest can fall. So, as you tuck yourself in tonight, let the story of the Khmer Empire and Angkor Wat be your bedtime tale. A saga of grandeur and decay, A reminder that while we may build monuments that defy time, the forces of nature and human frailty are the true architects of history. Sweet dreams of kings and temples, may they inspire you, and may their lessons guide us all.